Once I rose above the noise and confusion, just to get a glimpse beyond this illusion. I was soaring ever higher, but I flew too high. Though my eyes could see, I still was a blind man. Though my mind could think, I still was a madman. I hear the voices when I'm dreaming. I can hear them say, carry on my wayward son. There'll be peace when you are done. Lay your weary head to rest. Don't you cry no more.
Please take your seats. Our program will begin in 10 minutes.
My charade is the event of the season, and if I claim to be a wise man, well, it surely means that I don't know. On the stormy sea of moving emotion, tossed about I'm like a ship on the ocean. I set a course for winds of fortune, but I hear the voices say, carry on my wayward son. There'll be peace when you are done. Lay your weary head to rest. Don't you cry no more. No! Carry on, you will always remember. Carry on, nothing equals the splendor. Now your life's no longer empty. Surely heaven waits for you. Carry on, my wayward son. There'll be peace when you are done. Lay your weary head to rest. Don't you cry. Don't you cry no There must be some kind of way out of here, said a joker to the thief. There's too much confusion, I can't get no relief. Businessman there, drink my wine. Plowman, dig my earth. None will level on the mine. Nobody of it is worth. Hey, hey.
take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. Our program will begin now. Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg's Derek DeCloé and Caroline Gage.
Good morning. I'm Caroline Gage, head of the Americas for Bloomberg News. Welcome to the 11th Annual Canadian Finance Conference.
I'm Derek DeCloé. I'm the managing editor for Canada for Bloomberg News, and we're very glad you could all join us today in New York.
Today we're going to hear from a variety of esteemed business, economic, government leaders who are going to talk to us about what they're seeing across their industries and the Canadian economy at large.
And we'll continue the tradition of this event of providing timely and actionable insights for a global audience of leaders and investors. So before we get started, we do have a couple of announcements and housekeeping items.
First, we'd like to acknowledge our sponsor, National Bank of Canada Financial Markets.
For those who are watching this event online, if you experience any issues with the audio or video quality, try first to refresh your browser, or you can use the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen to get support. We've partnered with an audio-to-text platform, which is transcribing this discussion in real time to make it more accessible. You can access that transcription via the link in the session description.
We would love to hear from you throughout the program, so please ask questions. If we like them, we will incorporate them into our various interviews and panels. So to submit questions virtually, please click the white tab on the right side of the video window. And for those of you in the room with us, you can submit questions by scanning the QR code on the screen.
You can also engage with us on social media using the hashtag BBG Canadian Finance.
So with that, please welcome Tom Clark, Consul General of Canada in New York, who will share with us some opening remarks. Thank you.
Hi and good morning. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of being in the green room and somebody saying, now here's Tom Clark, and you're going, no, I'm back here. Anyway, I've now had my morning run and I feel great. Thank you so much. Caroline and Derek, thank you very much for kicking us off here today. Mesdames, Messieurs, il me fait grand plaisir d'être avec vous ce matin. Thank you all very much for joining us for this great conference. I'd like to begin by thanking Bloomberg and the Banque Nationale du Canada for organizing this conference with such a great lineup of panelists and speakers. I also want to say how wonderful it is that this conference is back in person after a few minor years of inconvenience being online. I think we would all agree that there is simply no substitute for in-person events. But it's also wonderful that many people are able to join us online in this hybrid format. The dual format of this year's event really gives us the best of both worlds. And I think maybe that's a lesson that we've all taken from what we've been through in the pandemic. I was very impressed to learn, by the way, that this is the 11th year that Bloomberg and conference sponsor National Bank Financial have organized this conference. 1 year is good. And when you get to the second year, you can say this is our second annual. And that's sort of an expression of optimism. But quite frankly, by the time you get to 11, it's become a tradition and an institution. And I can think of nothing better than this conference to have reached that mark. A lot has changed since the inaugural conference, but one constant has been the outstanding job that they do to get experts who can provide their insights into the Canadian economy and the capital markets. This is a particularly exciting time for me, having moved to New York just this last spring, meaning I'm no longer new in the job, but I'm no longer a veteran. I'm in that weird in-between time when you're neither. But it has been a real honor for me to serve my country in this role, which, as many of you know, is my, or some of you would know, is my third profession. I was, like the folks here at Bloomberg, involved in journalism for many years, followed by time in the business world as chairman of one of the largest consulting companies in Canada. And now representing my country here in New York, which is, well, it's New York. It's the biggest platform in the world and the richest in the world. I'm looking forward to strengthening my relationship with the financial sector during my tenure here, which is, after all, the thing that makes the world go round. And nothing, frankly, is more important to us than the financial sector here in New York. This conference is important because of the economic linkages between the United States and Canada, whether capital market flows, direct investment, trade flows, or labor flows, are an important part of the growth formula for both of our great nations. Here today are issuers, buy-side investors, and market intermediaries from Canada and the United States. You are all here to ensure the vital flow of capital between our two countries. Today is an occasion to hear from a wide range of experts on Canada's economic outlook, the Canadian housing market, the impact of climate change, the state of banking and capital markets, as well as investment opportunities in Canada. It's also great to see that provincial representatives from Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan will all be addressing this conference today. I think that's marvelous. The conference is also an excellent opportunity to showcase the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship. Indeed, no two nations depend more on each other for their mutual prosperity and security than the United States and Canada. I simply cannot understate the value of our economic relationship. And of course, as you all know, it goes beyond economy as well. It goes to family. It goes to friendships. It goes to the things that we have built over almost 200 years together. And I'm fond of saying there are literally no two nations anywhere in the world who share a border who would not in a nanosecond trade their situation for ours. Ours is the most unique relationship in the world. We're bound by geography, history, values, economy, environment, and through our resolve to improve the lives of our citizens on both sides of the border. The cooperation has resulted in one of the richest and freest regions in the entire world. Canada and the U.S. share one of the largest trading relationships in the world, with nearly $1.3 trillion in bilateral trade in goods and services just in 2022. It's probably going to be bigger in 2023 when we add up the numbers. Canada is the largest single export market for the United States. More than 70% of Canada's goods and exports go to the United States. Millions of U.S. jobs depend on trade and investment with Canada. The U.S. exports almost as many goods and services to Canada, about $426 billion, than to China, Japan, and Germany combined. That's 431. Canada buys over 2 times more goods from the United States than from China, which is $357 billion, versus $156 billion. That's the difference between China and the United States. Canada buys over 2 times more goods from the U.S. than from China. The U.S. is the single greatest investor in Canada. In 2021, U.S. equity investment in Canada was $406.4 billion. You've got skin in the game, to say the least. Canada is also the 3rd largest source of cumulative foreign direct investment in the United States. In 2021, the stock of Canadian investment in the U.S. stood at $528 billion. Now, this conference is happening at a challenging time globally, a time characterized by political instability and, sadly, as we all know, conflict in many parts of the world. In the last 19 months, we've also seen rising interest rates around the globe and a tightening of liquidity conditions in many countries. This has led to a higher cost of capital for businesses and higher cost of financing for consumers, and hence lower anticipated GDP growth. Now, despite these challenges, though, I think the story coming out of Canada is pretty encouraging. Let me give you a few numbers. Canada's GDP is now 3.4% larger than before the pandemic, which makes it the second strongest recovery in the G7, second only, of course, to the United States. And while growth will be subdued going forward, economists expect Canada to avoid a recession. According to the IMF, Canada will have the strongest growth in the G7 next year. On the labor market, more than 1 million additional Canadians are employed today than before COVID-19. Our unemployment rate remains low at just 5.7%. Canadian consumer price inflation has also come down considerably since its June 2022 peak of 8.1%. We are now at 3.1% as of October. Canada is also on a good fiscal track. The IMF estimates that Canada has seen the largest fiscal consolidation in the G7 between 2020 and 2023, and expects that Canada's net debt to GDP ratio to remain the lowest of the G7 countries by far, even lower than some other AAA-rated countries. And Canada is AAA-rated. According to the Fall Economic Statement in Canada, which was released last week, the federal debt to GDP ratio is projected to decline from 2024-25 onwards and every year after that. But despite our resilient economy, we need to continue to address challenges with open and clear eyes. Persistently high inflation and affordability concerns, especially in housing, are dinner table conversations right across Canada and, I might add, right across the United States as well. And addressing these challenges will require continued sound policy stewardship. Beyond more immediate challenges, this is also a time of great opportunity as we see rapid technological advances, think generative AI, and economic transformations taking place around the globe that are redefining how we do business. Canada is not sitting on the sidelines, merely observing. Canada, in fact, is in the fight and is moving forward with an ambitious agenda. Allow me to focus on three key themes: immigration, infrastructure, and innovation. On immigration, attracting the world's best and brightest is a national priority. In 2023, we plan to welcome 465,000 permanent residents to Canada. This will rise to 485,000 next year and 500,000 by 2025, representing 1.2% of our entire population. Infrastructure, let's deal with that. For supply chains and nearshoring, or what I prefer to call value shoring, there is a global race to secure access to critical minerals such as zinc, graphite, and nickel, the foundation of modern and sustainable technology. They're the building blocks for renewable energy production and storage, electric vehicle batteries and motors, and consumer electronics and security technologies of the future. Canada is investing $3.8 billion in building these value chains today. Let me deal with innovation. Innovation is, simply put, the understanding that better is always possible. It is the key that unlocks possibilities and opportunities. It is what allows us to adapt to change and prepare for the future. Canada is spurring economic growth, helping create well-paying jobs, and growing our competitive advantage by investing in ideas, businesses, and communities. We have the most educated workforce in the world, and we've been recognized as the best country in the G20 to do business. Through our Global Innovation Clusters program, we're doubling down on driving innovation by investing over $700 million to accelerate ecosystems in industries where Canada is leading from coast to coast. Digital technologies in British Columbia, alternative proteins in the prairies, advanced manufacturing in Ontario, AI in Quebec, and ocean technologies in Atlantic Canada, just to name a few. These three I's are an important part of our economic plan to invest in a growing and clean economy. Now, as I was fond of saying when I practiced journalism, I'm no economist, and everybody believed me. But I have it on very good authority that these three I's form the main elements of Robert Solo's model of economic growth: labor through immigration, capital through investment in infrastructure, and local productivity through innovation. In sum, economic growth and prosperity must be built on a foundation of sound and steadfast monetary and fiscal policy, as well as targeted policies that encourage labor flows, promote capital formation, and encourage innovation. And this also requires capital to flow freely between our two countries, which is why the issues discussed at this conference are absolutely vital. I believe Canada is an incredibly attractive investment destination for U.S. and multinational companies whose success will allow our economies to grow and flourish economically in the 21st century. I want to give you just one last number because I think it really underscores the relationship between Canada and the United States. In the time that it has taken me to give this speech, almost $200 million in goods and services has flowed across the border between Canada and the United States. It's an incredible relationship. Merci beaucoup. Je vous souhaite une excellente journée. Thank you all very much. Please enjoy this conference. And on behalf of the Government of Canada, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Stéfane Marion, Chief Economist and Strategist at National Bank of Canada, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Caroline Gage.
Stéfane, thank you for joining us.
Bonjour, Caroline.
Bonjour. My French is not going to be good enough to sustain this interview in French. But historically, you've been pretty sanguine about the prospects for the Canadian economy, yet you're a little gloomy these days.
Yeah,
Walk us through what you're seeing.
Yeah, so Tom spoke to the structural potential that we have in Canada. I still believe in some upside. But, you know, I'm here to speak to the shorter term, and next year will be tough for Canada. So I'm less constructive than I usually am at this point in time.
Why do you see it being tough for the next year?
Well, we're stagnating right now, and I know you have a cool chart.
I do have a cool chart from you,
and you can see that GDP's been quite stagnant for the past few months, and I think what we're going to see this week is going to show more stagnation in the third quarter. Big difference from the U.S.
Well, your chart's speaking to how monetary policy is working. Why is that? Why has it been more effective?
Not all countries are the same in terms of transmission of monetary policy. So if you have a more levered country like we have at the consumer level in Canada, and you have mortgage duration at roughly 3 years versus Americans that can have 2 years, your transmission monetary policy will operate faster. So for the 35%, so U.S. and Canada are quite similar. 35% of households are homeowners with mortgages. But because of mortgage duration in Canada at roughly 3 years, then transmission monetary policy is faster. And the consumer, the household, the homeowner in Canada is being hit faster.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, what are Canadian consumers experiencing in this rate environment?
Again, the mortgage interest rate costs are up 33% over the past year. There's no precedent for that. So there was, some portion of households that were at variable rates and others that are at fixed rates. And what you're going to see in the coming year is, roughly 50% of fixed rate mortgages will be reset or renewed at a much higher rate. So the potential for a mortgage reset shock at the consumer level is higher than the U.S. For the 37% of households that are renters, both Canada and U.S., same pain. Rent inflation is surging on both sides of the border, but the homeowners in Canada being hit faster than in the U.S. Will come in the U.S.
Yes, well, but there are a lot of people with 30-year fixed-rate mortgages that don't want to move right now. So,
So, but one thing, Caroline, for sure, like the payment shock in Canada is at the household level. In the U.S., it will be at the corporate level, as these corporate debt will be reset in 2024 and 2025. So, household, Canada, corporates in the U.S.
So before we go a little bit deeper, I was wondering if you could just share some high-level numbers with us. I mean, what do you see happening with GDP, inflation, and what does that mean for rates?
GDP, easy, 0%. That's for 2024.
Okay.
So if you're depressed about that, by the way, about my gloomy forecast for Canada, the federal government has just introduced a GST rebate for psychotherapy. You can take advantage of that. So, and a more difficult profit environment for corporations. So again, this is a transmission of monetary policy, so no growth. Inflation will come down, but Caroline, it's going to be tough to keep it below 3% for the long haul, given that, climate change or energy transition is inflationary by nature, right?
Yep. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. But then before we move on, rates, what's going to happen?
I should be giving you more than 200 basis points of rate cuts in Canada next year, but I can't just because inflation is stickier on some of these components that you'll show in the next few months. But one thing, you're not going to see, Canada's not just one country, it's different regions. So the transmission of monetary policy would be quite different from one province to another. So if you take inflation, if you exclude mortgage and interest rate costs, Canada's the only country, by the way, that has mortgage and interest rate costs in the CPI. So as the Bank of Canada raises rates, then it impacts inflation. So if you take out this mortgage interest rate cost, you can see that from one province to another, it's quite different. So at one end of the spectrum, we have monetary policy, which is extremely restrictive in Alberta, 5% real rates. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have Quebec at 1.9%. Now, what explains that? Well, in Alberta, there's a 70% homeownership rate. In Quebec, it's below 60%. So clearly, mortgage and interest rate cuts will bite more from one province to another. So it's all different. But I would say nationally, it's restrictive monetary policy, but more so in Western provinces.
So, and obviously one of the key things here, as you've mentioned, is housing.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you see? What do you see happening
restrictive
with home
monetary
prices? What do you? I mean.
Yeah, you're right, Caroline. With restrictive monetary policy, home prices should be coming down. But look, they went down.
Everyone's been waiting for that for what? How many years now?
Oh my God, long time.
Yes.
Yeah. Not going to happen, in my opinion. But so home prices are stickier, and that's a conundrum for the central banks because they were assuming with higher rates that home prices would actually come down, and some people were calling for a 30% drop in home prices, like we've seen in the U.S. But it's just simply not happening.
Well, so how do you fix this problem? I mean, housing at the core of it.
Well, Tom spoke a bit about that, but I think the next slide is very, very telling. The issue that we have from a housing perspective, it's a very special year, 2022, that was, in terms of population growth. It exceeded 1 million. And there's only one precedent in Canadian history where population increased by more than 600,000 in an entire year. A very precise moment, Caroline, March 31st, 1949, at midnight, when Newfoundland joined the Federation. And you can see that on that chart. After that, and that never happened. So 1 million last year was like adding to Newfoundland an entire year, and that comes with no infrastructure. So you can understand the impact that's going to have, demand for home prices, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the big deal. And this year, by the way, run rate, another million. There's no precedent in Canadian history for a 2 million increase in population in 2 years. Think about it. That's 20 million from a U.S. perspective.
So how do you solve those structural issues? I mean, home prices that are, and there seems to be very little supply. I mean, how do you actually fix for this problem and a massive surge in population, which doesn't, I mean, despite all of these problems, do you see that slowing anytime soon, or how do you see this dynamic playing out? That's
why we have Romy Bauer on the panel a little bit later on from CMHC. She's going to tell us what she sees about it. I think seriously, there's a supply-demand imbalance right now. The housing deficit that we have in this country right now is, we're building one home. Historically, we built one home for 1.8 people that joins the working age population. Now we're at one home for 4.2 people. So we would need to build 600,000 home starts per year. to accommodate the population surge. The best we've ever done as a country was maybe 370,000 home starts. So we have a massive supply issue with demand like we've never seen before. So I know Tom spoke to federal government wanting to invite 500,000 permanent immigrants, but the capacity for the economy to deal with the permanent immigrants plus students plus refugees plus temporary workers at 1 million, we're just not there. So I think we need to recalibrate on the demand side and yes, accommodate supply.
So how do you do that? I mean, obviously lots of money in Canada, lots of money investing in real estate more broadly. I mean, why is this problem seemingly unfixable?
Well, all governments have to work together, and clearly, if the thing that also characterizes Canada is 58% of GDP is driven by only the 5 major metropolitan areas. That's more than twice the concentration in the U.S. So young, gifted immigrants will want to settle in large urban areas. So the issue that I have right now is that we're trying to find a recipe for the entire country. I think we need to focus on the 5 biggest metropolitan areas, so Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Edmonton, and Calgary, and find a solution that is custom-made to accommodate more supply on that. So let's stop deploying that Canada-wide. Let's focus on these 5 major metropolitan areas, and we can get more traction. So more supply, but maybe demand will have to be adjusted downward. It's just 1 million. We don't have the capacity to adjust.
Yep. I wanted to get your perspective on sort of a broader fiscal outlook and how you see that impacting the economy.
Well, there's the fiscal, but if you go to the next slide, we forgot to speak to what happens in immigration. So the thing is, from the bank, the previous one. So on the inflation side, if you want to move back one slide.
Sorry.
So just to tell you, this is the conundrum for the central bank. This is why I can't give you 200 basis points of rate cuts next year. The shelter component continues to accelerate, and that's a reflection of what's happening on the population side. So from a Bank of Canada perspective, that's an issue. But at the same time, Caroline, if there's 1 million people coming in the country, then that needs more government spending on schools, healthcare, childcare, infrastructure, generally speaking, which Tom was speaking to. But I think we have yet to grasp the full issue right now. There's a lot of government spending that will need to go along with that population growth. And from a Bank of Canada,
both at the federal and at the provincial level.
Oh yes, because the spending will be at the municipal level for everything to accommodate anything that comes along with great population. Population growth is good down the road. But at 1 million, it is a capacity constraint that pushes inflation higher. Again, there are no other countries in the OECD that are dealing with this type of population dynamic at this point in time.
So basically, very hard to get this inflation picture under control.
Keeping it below 3% is a challenge at this point in time. Hence, modest rate cuts in 2024. We do have 100 basis points of rate cuts.
So lots of spending on the issues that you just raised, but I suppose, could you fit that more broadly? With sort of the broader fiscal plans, and
I just wanted to talk about subsidies. You're right. I just wanted to demystify a few things. Canada's been depicted as a pariah in the industrial world in terms of subsidizing its fossil fuel industry. That's not the case. According to the IMF, we have the lowest subsidies in the world, and where the Americans and Mexicans are increasing their subsidies, we're lowering our subsidies. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and I think we need to grasp what we have. We're very ambitious on climate change and our targets, but we have yet to find a solution to where we want the economy to be. For example, Australia embraces its resource sector. Canada's a little bit more shy on that front. And for me, that's an issue. For Canada, for example, to decide to cap fossil fuel at production would be a major handicap for potential GDP. And less potential GDP means less government revenues, and then you have this population inflows that needs to be dealt with. So I think the resource sector is one way that Canada could show the world how we do energy transition with good governance, because by the way, the World Bank says that Canada has the best governance of any country in the world as a fossil fuel producer. This is why we could show the world. And we could use our resource sector to decommission, for example, Asia's coal-fired power plants, which would be good for the planet. So I think we need to reposition our climate targets to make sure that we're dealing with the issue facing the planet and not just Canada in the world where the supply chain has completely been altered in the past 5 years.
And then, just dovetailing back to the regional slide, the impact of these clean energy policies on different regions like Alberta, is going to be disproportionate, presumably.
You're absolutely right. And without Alberta and Saskatchewan, by the way, the CO2 carbon emissions in Canada would not have been reduced. So it's 70% of carbon reduction in Canada has been achieved by Alberta and Saskatchewan. I think there's still scope for the two provinces to do more, but there's got to be a point in time where you say, well, what do we want to do as a nation with 1 million population? Well, we need to reindustrialize. And you know what? That was not part of the government's plan in 2015, but the supply chain has been altered, and we could be massive opportunities for Canada. There's no better place to be in a world of energy and food insecurity than Canada. So the potential is there. I strongly agree with Tom, but we need to reposition our industrial policy.
So views on clean energy policies are very clear. I mean, on the industrial front, I mean, how is Bidenomics affecting Canada? And can you speak about the strategy that we've seen, in terms of the global subsidy wars, trying to attract plants? I mean, is this effective?
Yeah, so big time impact on Canada, and Tom spoke to government investments in EVs, batteries, and everything. And yes, the federal government has made a good effort recently to try to match U.S. policies, but we need to catch up because our productivity is lagging the U.S. We need to make Canada more attractive, and I think for me, AI is a potential for Canada to catch up to the U.S. And maybe we should reindustrialize in certain industries that have been shunned by other governments. For example, 98% of drugs used in Canada, legal drugs, by the way, medication, right?
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
are imported. So we used to have an industry right now, and now we have 2,000 drugs in a short supply in Canada. So this is one way and it's very polluting to do, drug production. So from my view is that we should use our energy sector, take away some of that production from other countries that use this to, using coal, bring it back to Canada and helping the nation. So there's nothing wrong with producing medication. Yes, it's polluting. Yes, it takes a lot of energy, but we need to do it. AI is extremely energy intensive, Caroline, and there are 3 centers of excellence in Canada. It's in Montreal, Toronto, and Edmonton. We need to lever this up. We're number 5 in the world in terms of AI. We should be striving to be number 3. That's been our historical position. We must not drop below number 5. Let's use this. Let's spend on that. And this is why we can catch up to the U.S. in terms of productivity.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the tech space in a second, but just coming back to the subsidies, I mean, so it sounds like you think it's a good idea for Canada to spend money to attract things like Stellantis and these plants and other things like that, or what's your view?
I think we're quite concentrated right now. There are other industries that might be less popular, but as I say, the drug industry, we used to have a big one in Canada. We need to bring some back from a national security standpoint, both from a North American standpoint. There should be more of this production coming back to Canada. More traditional manufacturing also. It's not just EV, Caroline. It's like if you're going to build more electricity capacity, well, there's copper wiring and all this stuff that seems to be old industry. So I know people want the new stuff, but a lot of the old stuff needs to be done. And given our capital stock in manufacturing, I only see upside for Canada if we decide that, yes, we will reindustrialize. But yes, it's a little bit more polluting, but from a planet perspective, better to do it in Canada than the rest of the world.
With that being said, it sounds like you do think it's a good idea to spend more on the sort of the tech front in terms of Canada's position there. And can you talk about what you've seen in terms of productivity?
Yeah, well, we're not doing well.
Back to the gloomy outlook, yeah.
No, but seriously, there's an asset liability mismatch between our demographic ambitions and our capital stock, which is no higher now in manufacturing than it was in 1989 when we signed the first free trade agreement. So again, there's only upside for us in manufacturing if we decide that, yeah, we will reindustrialize the country, and we have all the tools to do it and all the resources to do it. And when I talk about resources, not just natural resources, human resources. We have the capital. We don't have the capital stock, but we certainly have the labor stock and good people that are coming to our country.
So we just walked through a number of different ways the government is spending or needs to spend. I mean, where is this money going to come from? How do you see the budget working here?
Well, here's the thing. I think you have a next slide, right? Is it? Are we there? Yeah,
yes.
Good. So look at net debt Canada versus the rest of the G7. We're at 15%. We did a great job after the 1990, the Great Recession in Canada, to recapitalize our pension funds, to make sure that we have discipline on government spending. So our deficit is one of the lowest, is the lowest in the G7 at the general government level, right? This is all levels of government. And net debt is quite low, so there's some upside there. And to your point, Caroline, you will not compete with the rest of the G7 without some public sector involvement in industrial policy, and we have the capacity to do so. So yes, that means more government spending, but the thing about Canada, our very aggressive immigration policy, we also have the best social mobility in the OECD. So people that come to Canada have social mobility, and we have talented people that will contribute to potential GDP, and that means a higher taxpayer base. That's why we have the highest participation rate in the OECD, or labor for employment to population ratio. That's your taxpayer base, right? So if you secure your taxpayer base, then you can keep on spending. I'm not saying to run deficits for the foreseeable future. I'm just saying there's an opportunity here to do even better if we decide to be a little bit more broader in terms of our industrial policy than limiting it to certain sectors like we've done in recent months. It's just better for potential GDP growth down the road.
A little more optimistic there, Sonny. But can you, the dollar, the Canadian dollar, what do you see happening versus the U.S.?
Well, if we decide to come up with a policy of capping oil and gas, and like that's been floated, the idea has been floating, then you will undermine your potential GDP, and your Canadian dollar will lose 10 cents. So hopefully the federal government doesn't go there. If you think it's just your normal cycle, like my current assumption would be, well, listen. Yeah, we're going to lose 6, 7 cents on Canadian dollar. It's a cycle coming. I think it's a global cycle. There's no precedent in modern history for 500 basis points of rate hikes in the OECD countries without some impact on collateral damage and some deleveraging happening in the following year. So I think it's going to be weak growth next year, not just in Canada, globally. So yeah, Canadian dollar will go down to 142. But if we deploy some of these policies I was speaking to, then I'm more optimistic down the road. So we go to 142, and then we can appreciate from there on.
Last question. What do you see as the risk to your forecast, to the upside and the downside? What are the key things that could change?
Again, energy transition, if it's messy, can be stagflationary. I don't think we want to go there. Now, I think we need to have policies where we have visibility on the carbon tax at the producer level anyway. If we want to abolish it at the consumer level, so be it. But producers, if you want to do carbon capture and all this, well, we need some visibility on that, so we can have a carbon tax that goes up and down all the time, because that makes it more difficult for corporations to adapt. So I'm quite optimistic that Canada can lead the world in decarbonization. We have good technology here, but we need some visibility. So a little bit more, less rocky in terms of implementing energy transition. That could be my biggest risk.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your views.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg's Matthew Dion.
Well, good morning, everyone. We'll be speaking with Pierre Fitzgibbon this morning. He's the Minister of Economy, Innovation and Energy in Quebec. He'll be joining us virtually from the National Assembly of Quebec in Quebec City. Thank you for joining us, Pierre, this morning. Bonjour.
Morning.
A few data points before we start. Quebec's gross domestic product in 2022 was around 430 billion Canadian dollars. That's slightly more than half of the GDP of Ontario. The net debt to GDP ratio is down 15 basis points over the past 10 years to 38%. And your government, Pierre, has slashed the province's growth forecast by half for 2024 to 0.7%, a little less than Canada at 0.9%. Pierre, credit agencies gave Quebec a better outlook in the past couple of years, upgrading the rating. How will you qualify Quebec's reputation on financial markets today compared to, let's say, 10 years ago?
you, Mathieu. And first of all, I apologize. My colleague, Mr. Finance, Éric Girard, was supposed to be with you in person, but we're currently negotiating with the public civil servants. That's why he's here with me. But to answer your question, I think the reputation is good. I think that we, over the last 10 years, 27% of our debt was issued internationally. And Mr. Girard's objective is to maintain kind of a 20-30%. Yes, we reduced the GDP growth next year, but I think we've got a prudent management of our public finances. Obviously, we want to maintain all our state or critical missions, and we need to have some previsibility in the market. I think we've gone a long way, we'll get to that I'm sure later, about reducing the productivity gap with Ontario, for example, which is our marker. We've made some great progress, still work to be done. So between a prudent management of our financial resources and a dynamic growth pattern in our economic development, I think we can achieve the objective to be rigorous in our debt to GDP.
Since the pandemic, the debt service went from $8 billion to $10 billion. The net debt went from, will be in 2024 to $218 billion. That's up $46 billion since the pandemic. What room do you have left to increase Quebec's debt and continue investing?
Well, on the one hand, I think Mr. Girard stated publicly that he wants to maintain, he wants to aim for a 33% debt ratio by 2033 and get down to eventually 30%. And obviously managing that through coming out of the crisis, coming out of the pandemic is a challenge. However, we did have significant growth in economic development over the last 2 years. Now it's obviously, we have a good environment, but not through non-cost cutting, but through making sure that we don't increase our expenditure too much. And we're, as we speak, beginning our budget process for next year, and we want to maintain our budgetary level, but reallocating funds in areas where we can create more economic growth. So I think we'll be able to manage through obviously higher increase out of the pandemic, but we want to keep our target at 33% by 2033.
For the Canadian government, coming back to a balanced budget doesn't seem so much like a priority. Is it one for the Quebec government?
Yeah, it is. I think in the last mise à jour, the economic update we published in November, we are aiming at 2027-2028 for a balanced budget. Of course, it's a challenge given where we're starting right now with the slowdown in the economy, but we need to keep that target, frankly, because it's so easy to give excuse that we'll postpone that. But in the meantime, of course, we'll be careful not to cut into social services. This is something that obviously is not negotiable. Whether it's health service, education, those are critical missions for the state, and we'll have to manage. I think all the ministry involved requiring budgetary increase realize that it's probably going to be difficult in the next couple of years because that target is important.
Pierre, I'm happy to have you on today because you are the energy minister, and Hydro-Quebec, which is the government-owned utility, is planning to expand in the next decade to invest about $100 billion by 2035 on new generation capacity, new transmission lines. Now that we've talked about that, how do you plan to fund this expansion? Because that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, it is. And I think, obviously, glad you bring that up. Merging economy and energy made a lot of sense because obviously we have a focus to fill the gap with Ontario, the U.S. eventually on the productivity. So we need to create wealth in our different industrial kind of patterns or clusters, should I say. At the same time, we want to decarbonize, and we're 99% green energy in Quebec sourcing. So we want to be specifically increasing the Quebec green energy capabilities to further speed our process to decarbonize, yet to also supply industries. The funding is $160 billion, I guess, in the next 10 years. Between Hydro-Quebec's ability, between the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, likely between the Quebec government to some extent as well, I think that looking at the profit of Hydro-Quebec, looking at the increment is large, but I think it's manageable. And so far, we have Michael Sabia now that heads the Hydro-Quebec, as you know, previously the Caisse de dépôt, previously Deputy Finance Minister in Ottawa. So we've got the right person who can balance, so to speak, the issue of financing and the issue of controlling the growth that we need to propulse at Hydro-Quebec.
But don't you think that credit agencies could see that as a risk, and because that would increase the debt, the overall debt of Quebec?
Yeah, well, at the same time, I think as we decarbonize, which is the primary mission of Hydro-Quebec right now, we can decarbonize and creating wealth. I think Stéfane has mentioned that earlier. We're using that for the EV cluster strategy, mining. So all of these initiatives that are required to enhance our ability to supply green energy will be allocated to industrial concerns that will create wealth as well. So there will be return for those investments. I think this is what we have to prove the financial community.
For years, the Quebec government was coming in New York saying, we have surpluses of electricity. We have too much electricity to sell. And now, like, we're close to a shortage pretty much in Quebec, or a shortfall. What happened there? Was it poor planning, or?
No, I think we're victim of our success, frankly. As we go through the decarbonation pathway, how many places in the world that can supply low-cost green energy? Not that many places. So, I mean, to give you an indication, between 2000 and 2021, there was only one project in Quebec that required more than 50 megawatts. I've got over 50 on my desk. So we are a victim of that success where companies want to come in Quebec, whether it's produce green aluminum, whether it's produce green steel, whether it's produce cathode anode for the battery components. So we're faced with that so-called success. Now, of course, our issue now is to allocate those megawatts. So clearly there ain't going to be any problem with residential, consumer, with commercial, hospital, and school, for example. So obviously that's being taken care of in the next forever. So now what I have to do with my team, because we now have energy and economy together, we need to have a filter to determine whom should get the energy. And that filter is basically GHG reduction, economic wealth creation, and being socially acceptable, because that's obviously an issue as well. So that's going to be the filter we're going to use. So yes, we have kind of shortage right now. We cannot fulfill all the requirements, but you know what? I've been talking to companies, and the action plan that we, Hydro-Quebec, has presented a few weeks ago. A lot of companies saying, like, we'll wait. We'd rather wait a year or two before we make a project, because we want to access that renewable green energy, which will be solar, wind, and hydro for a large extent. So I think we're in a good position. But yes, there is a constraint. There is a tightness of the demand supply, but I think it's to the Quebecers' benefit.
When we started this conversation, you mentioned the wealth gap between Ontario and Quebec, and your government is quite, I would say, obsessed about it. Am I right?
Yeah.
In 2018, the wealth gap, so it's the real GDP per capita pretty much here. So in 2018, the wealth gap was 16%, 2022, 13.5%, 2026, the target is 10%. Why are you so concerned about the wealth gap?
Well, I think it's a marker. I mean, in politics, I realize, because I come from the private industry, if you don't have any marker and you just focus on generalities, nothing gets done. So when I came in position with the Premier Legault, we focus on the GDP per capita, which is not the only driver, by the way, but it's one which is easily measurable. So as we reduce the productivity gap, or as we increase the wealthness of the Canadians, of our Quebecers, I think it's going to ultimately create some wealth. Now, the drivers to get that done are primarily productivity. I think Stéfane, Marion has mentioned that, and we have a big focus on that, and we have a lot of the programs at Investissement Quebec to help companies to digitalize and robotize and so forth. And we have also an issue with startups. So we're using that as a marker, but what's important is a driver underneath that will move the needle. And I think we're clearly working hard on innovation, working hard on the decarbonation, which we create wealth, and HGR is putting some financial incentive into that. And we have a fiscal plan, which for the corporate with the tax credit, it's pretty relevant. So we have between myself and the HGR put the features together so we can move the needles and reduce it. And we, as you said, we were at 16% gap in Ontario, and now we're at 13. It's still a large gap, but the issue is not when you finalize to get to zero, it's the pathway to get there. And I think we've got certainly the motivation to continue to increase productivity, which is ultimately the driver of the wealth creation.
Quebecers are the most taxed people in North America. Any plans to reverse that?
We partially reduced it. We reduced the 1%, the different levels of taxation. I think we are highly taxed on the consumer side. At the same time, you have to look at the cost of living, and there's other social services paid by the state. So obviously, one has to be very careful looking only at tax rate. But we are cognizant that there's been a pressure on Quebecers to compare to the rest of Canada, and Mr. Girard has announced some pretty important reduction points. We want to aim at reducing that, but as you said earlier in the interview, at the same time, we want to make sure we maintain social services in Quebec and we don't increase our debt per GDP. So there's a matrix there that we have to maneuver. So we have to be careful. I don't think there'll be short-term further reduction of taxation for individuals. If we did it, we need to focus on our rigor in the financial management of our debt, but we have this balance we need to maintain because we want to be attractive for individuals and also attractive for corporations to do business here in Quebec.
Pierre, let's talk about your passion, EV battery plants. There's Nordvolt, the Swedish manufacturer that will set up shop near Montreal with a $7 billion factory. Along with the Canadian government, the government of Quebec is investing in capital expansion about $1.4 billion and potentially up to $1.5 billion in operating expenses. My question is it the best use of Quebecers' money, or should we put this money in mining operations, for example, where we do have a real comparative advantage?
Well, I think a lot of people ask the question, are we putting too much effort into the battery file? Well, the battery file, call it the EV, electrification of transport. I look at our strategy, which is to get mining to battery materials, get the recycling done, because eventually we'll need urban mining, and also produce commercial EV vehicles. I think the reason we're excited about the battery is exactly what you just said. It's the first time ever in the history of Quebec that we're able to take a mineral, which is called as lithium, nickel, or graphite in the case of the battery components, and get to the mining up to the value added to eventually sell at Nordvolt, or to do cathode anode at GM POSCO and Ford EcoPro. It's the first time ever in the history of Quebec we're able to have a tight supply chain in an area. So the numbers, I mean, it's going to be about $15 billion invested in, so far we've announced. I think there's probably another 15 to come in the next 2 years. So there'll be a $30 billion industry. We start from scratch, but that includes mining. And I think that the integration of the supply chain makes Quebecers will enrich themselves with the value creation pathway. And we have other areas as well. We're going to be we could be one of the first in the world to make green aluminum, because Alcoa and Rio Tinto have created this technology called ELYSIS out of Quebec, and we'll put some investment there as well. And there's potentially green steel because we have high purity iron in the Labrador and Quebec area. So, I mean, we need to diversify. Yes, it's a lot of money, but at the same time, just to conclude on that, the 15 billion that we've announced of projects so far, the portion which we call grant is about 800 million so far, so less than the 5%. So yes, we have a lot of loans in there, and also we have some equity investment. So when you look at the makeup of the financial support, which is about 2.5, 3 billion out of 15, I think it's manageable. Only a portion of that is true grant. So I think we're seeding an industry that didn't exist. We used to make cars in Quebec. Those are my age. Remember, GM used to make Camaros in north of Quebec. But you know what? To me, making cars is not the issue now. I want to make sure that our critical minerals are converted to create the value-added chain in Quebec, which I think we're building right now.
There are a lot of young companies in there. Even Nordvolt actually is started in 2016, I think. How would you qualify the risk for the Quebec government? You said that there were a lot of loans, portion of equity. How would you qualify the risk for the government of Quebec?
Well, the risk is no. Will there be use for battery in 15 years? Because I mean, for most of the companies that come here in Quebec, the payback of our incentive is likely about 5 years. In the case of Nordvolt, it's 10 years. So therefore, will there be battery in 10 years? If the answer is no, then likely we will have just not created any value whatsoever. I don't think anybody here could sit down and say there won't be any battery. The question that people ask as well is that, what's the battery component, the material, the chemistry component of the battery? Will it be lithium-ion in 10 years? Maybe not, but you know what? Now the Nordvolt, GM, POSCO, EcoPro, Ford, they're agnostic. And at one point, if we have a cell made out of the sodium phosphate, more nickel, less lithium, these companies will adjust. So I think the focus here, or not the focus, of the major risk, will there be battery in 10, 15 years? I think asking the question is answering the question.
Another topic à la mode these days, beside EV batteries, are semiconductors. Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, Manuel Lopez Obrador, in January they announced they were planning to create a hub in North America to reshore semiconductors. What role can Quebec play in there? Because there's IBM in Quebec, which is the largest packaging facility in North America. So what role can Quebec play in that initiative?
Yeah, we did announce what we call the innovation zone. We have one, of course, with the energy transition with the EV5 we just spoke about. And the other one we have is quantum computing in Sherbrooke, where we work at IBM and other great companies' endeavors. But we have also our what we call Technum, which is our microelectronic innovation zone out of Bromo, which is north of south of Montreal, where IBM, Teledyne are present. And they have been working on semiconductor, taking the wafer and making a semiconductor on it for the last 10, 15 years. And given the Albany Alley, given that we have expertise there, given that IBM is focused also on enhancing their footprint in terms of that plant, and the expertise we build, because we have universities feeding as well some talent, I think we've got some attractiveness here for U.S. companies actually to come and work with us. And there's already a lot of discussion with some of the U.S. company involved with the CHIPS Act, which obviously is going to be a great lever for the U.S. And given that the U.S. and Quebec, our international trade, 75% is in the U.S., so obviously we are really close to the U.S. market. I think we hope to think that we also appreciated by the Americans, and we want to continue that relationship. So I think on the semiconductor, we could be a good complementary kind of footprint for the CHIPS Act being developed in the U.S. right now.
Are you willing to put as much money as you did in the EV battery supply chain for semiconductors?
Well, everything's relative, but I mean, in terms of incentive, I mean, we are a government that would like to intervene in areas where we think we can be a world champion. And I think on the EV side, I think, I'm going to talk about cathode anode, I think we could become the North American center of excellence. On semiconductor, of course, the U.S. will have predominantly the lion's share of the market, but you know what? There are areas where we can be very good. So if American company, other investors, when it comes to Quebec, built on our talent base, built on our footprint, C2MI, that's the name of the organization, yes, we'll be generous because semiconductor will be there for a long time, as I think battery will.
Last question, is the economy minister of Quebec concerned for 2024 in terms of forecasts we have?
Yeah, there's headwind, of course. My concern is that we have the Quebec economy is a small yet diversified economy. We have a lot of SMEs. SMEs are more vulnerable in tougher times. We did a good job during the pandemic with our programs. Now we have to be attentive to what's going on. I think it's going to be heated up. I think it's not a bad thing per se to have a balance between employees, employer. I think there's a re-equilibrium being done right now, but I need to stay focused on our SME because it could be tough for the next 12 to 18 months in terms of cost of doing business.
That was the Economy Minister of Innovation and Energy of Quebec. Thank you very much for joining us this morning from Quebec City.
My pleasure.
Please welcome to the stage Romy Bowers, CEO of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Ari Altstetter.
Romy Bowers, welcome to New York.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Oh, happy to have you. I guess we'll jump right in with the question that's perennially on all Canadians' minds. What's going to happen to home prices? Where are they going next?
No, fair enough. So as you can imagine, the interest rate increases have had a big impact on the market. I think house prices have softened, definitely. And especially when you compare how house prices rose during the pandemic, I think that was quite unprecedented. But from our perspective, the recent softening in house prices is sort of a cyclical phenomenon. There is a huge mismatch between the demand for housing and the supply. We have a huge housing shortage in Canada, and we feel that that's going to sustain house prices going forward. So once we get over this interest rate shock, we feel that house prices will continue to increase.
Is there a projection for when that bottom might be reached?
So from our perspective, I mean, it's hard to predict. I don't have a crystal ball, but if we feel that provided that the economy recovers and that growth continues, that we should be seeing house prices increase in the coming years.
The coming years, so not by 2024?
2024 could be the turnaround for sure, but honestly, I don't have a crystal ball, but let's hope that we have that soft landing and that economic growth will resume and that our economy starts growing again.
Okay. You mentioned, the supply shortage, which seems to undergird all the dynamics in Canada's housing market. The government has a goal to correct that.
Yes.
A very ambitious goal to double the pace of home construction by, I believe it's 2030. I speak to a lot of builders, and they don't think that's possible. They cite constraints of labor, of material, of municipal zoning regulations that slow things down. How do we achieve that goal?
So I would agree with you. The challenge that Canada has in terms of making the housing market more balanced is huge. CMHC estimates that currently we have about a 2 million unit housing shortage. And if things go as they are in terms of housing production, we think that that number is going to increase to 3.5 million by 2030. So this is why we have to double our housing starts. And there are a lot of barriers that prevent that from happening. And there's not one thing that's going to address this problem, but maybe I can just point out a few things. The first is we need to start building homes differently. We need an industrial strategy for home building in Canada. We produce about 200,000 homes annually in Canada, and we did that in 1970. So we need to really think about innovation in the housing construction sector to boost supply, to create homes of all types, specifically rentals, but also starter homes for those who are just entering the housing market. So that's one area. The second area is that I talk often about the national housing market, but as you know, housing is very local and regional. Many of the levers that hamper housing production are at the local level. So there have to be changes in policies in the municipalities to allow greater housing construction in established neighborhoods.
You work for the federal government, and you say that the municipal governments are the ones that hold a lot of the levers for whether or not houses gets built. What can the federal government do to incentivize or pressure municipal governments to make the changes needed to allow more home construction?
To address the housing crisis in Canada, my belief is that all levels of government need to work together. So one area where the federal government can play an important role is making the math work for builders. So this past fall, there was a change in our tax legislation to support rental construction in Canada. So that's one example of changing tax policies to support construction. That's one way. Another program that CMHC is responsible for right now is called the Housing Accelerator Fund. And basically, it's a way of providing incentives for municipalities to reform their planning processes and housing policies in general to support housing construction. So basically, the federal government is providing a bit of a carrot to incent changes at the municipal level.
So those are the carrots. What about the sticks, though? I mean, in the U.S., one policy that the federal government here has been talking about is making funding for infrastructure, local infrastructure, conditional on zoning changes. Is that something that could happen in Canada?
Yes, if you look at some of the recent pronouncements from the federal government does invest significantly in infrastructure, and the way we term it is there has to be conditionality. For the infrastructure money to flow, there has to be conditionality on certain housing outcomes at the municipal and provincial level. So I think that is something that Canada is looking at very seriously.
To make further federal funding to municipal governments dependent on zoning?
The infrastructure funding, that's correct.
Oh. CMHC has said that we need to, build 3.5 million homes to get to 2003 levels of affordability. Is that a goal that Canadians can expect to be accomplished? Is 2003 coming back?
Yeah. So the reason, part of our role is to really point out the numbers and what needs to be done. Do I think that by 2030 all that can be done? Probably not. Probably it's not a realistic goal. But unless we start talking about it now, setting targets, making sure that Canadians understand the nature of the housing crisis, I don't think change will happen. Our goal is to provide information to Canadians, to builders, other decision makers. So our goal is to run the numbers every year to figure out how many more houses do we need. And I know we talk about this as a housing crisis, but in some ways, it's a nice problem to have in that we are a growing country. Many people want to come to Canada to live, and there's a huge demand for housing. And I think it's on us as a country to set the conditions to create the housing units that meets the needs of all Canadians. So I'd like to think that CMHC's role is providing the facts, the numbers, and encouraging all stakeholders in the housing system, as you know is very complex, to work together to build the housing that all Canadians need.
If turning the clock back to 2003 levels of affordability is more of an aspirational goal, in terms of Canadians hoping to buy or rent a place, needing to buy or rent a place in the next few years, what do you think a reasonable hope or expectation is in terms of affordability? How much amelioration can they actually expect?
Honestly, it really depends on the actions. I think the federal government is making, very substantive steps to use their levers. I think it's we have to look at the private sector, who provides most of the housing in Canada, the role of municipalities in the provinces, and it really depends on how we all work together to address this issue. So, I'm definitely a glasses half full type of person. And Canada is a country of aspiration. And I feel like if we work together, we can address this issue. But I really feel that this coordination across government, across the private sector, working with nonprofits who provide housing for those most in need, that's what's really needed to address the housing issues in Canada right now.
Okay, so far we've talked a lot about the supply side of the equation, but demand is important too.
Absolutely.
So let's turn ourselves to one of the primary drivers of demand in the housing market, population.
Yes.
In Canada, it's been driven by immigration, and there has been a lot of criticism towards the federal government for very high immigration targets that have imbalanced supply and demand in the housing market. What do you think can be done to better align immigration to housing policy and the housing stock?
So one of the things that CMHC is doing is, as I mentioned, we're providing much more granular information about what type of housing is needed where. So we are playing our part in terms of understanding where the housing supply gaps exist across the country. And I think providing this information provides policymakers in immigration or other sectors with ideas about where there is more housing available, where newcomers to Canada can settle with rents and house prices that are more affordable. So that's one important way. Through better dissemination of information, we can target where people want to live in a much more constructive way. In addition to that, one of the things that prevents housing from being built in Canada is lack of skilled labor. We have an aging workforce in the construction trades, and I was very glad to see recently in some of the recent immigration policy announcements that there is a specific focus on attracting skilled labor to Canada. And we think it's true, immigration contributes to the housing demand, but it can also be part of the solution in terms of creating supply in Canada.
One thing that has been talked about is slowing the number of foreign students coming to Canada, particularly because the rental market has been under considerable strain, sort of at the forefront of the housing crisis. What do you think of that? What do you make of that as a potential solution?
I think there is a huge potential for organizations like CMHC to work with secondary school or post-secondary institutions in Canada. It's great that we have a large international student population, but educational institutions have to invest on-campus housing to house these students. And CMHC, we're willing to play our part in providing the finance tools to support the construction of this housing. But I think this is something that requires coordination between the federal government, provincial government, which has oversight over educational institutions. But again, something that I think needs to be in terms of before you increase international student enrollment, you have to make sure that you have the infrastructure to support them within your communities.
I mean, given it'll take a long time now to build new dorms, build new student housing across Canada, should we slow the rate of foreign student visas in the meantime?
So this is a question for every educational institution. The situation differs from institution to institution, from community to community. So I think in setting the acceptance levels or planning for international students, you really need to think about how many international students can your communities absorb from a housing perspective, and this is a very important conversation that we need to have.
Let's turn to mortgages. CMHC is a major insurer of mortgages in Canada. I'm wondering what you're seeing in your own data about arrears, about amortizations. What kind of strain are Canadians facing with this new high interest rate environment?
Yeah, so just on terms of arrears, arrears is a lagging indicator, so our arrears rates are very low. So there's no immediate issues that we see in terms of defaults. However, we do know that the increase in interest rates are putting a major strain on Canadian households. When you look at CMHC's book, we estimate that if interest rates remain at current levels, on average, when mortgages renew, our clients or Canadians should expect probably a 30 to 40% increase in mortgage payment, and that's pretty significant. There was a recent speech made by a senior official at the Bank of Canada saying that mortgage holders need to work with the banks to prepare for this interest rate shock, and we're very supportive of this messaging. We know that our banking clients are working very actively with Canadians to prepare for increased mortgage payments, and this is something that that absolutely needs to happen. When you look at the health of our book, we see people's incomes have grown. People are making down payments, so we're not. We don't want to call this a crisis in any way, but it's really, really important. Canadians are highly leveraged when it comes to mortgages, and that we have to be prepared for an environment where higher interest rates are here for longer.
So in your book right now, you're not seeing any distress?
We're not seeing any distress. About a third of our book has turned over already, so a third of our clients are already paying higher mortgages. But the bigger shock is going to come in 2024, 2025, and this is why thinking about this in advance for the renewal is very, very important.
Let's talk about that mortgage renewal cliff, the payment shock.
Yes.
What impact do you see that having on the housing market and on the economy?
So in terms of the housing market, I think the housing market dynamic is a little bit different in that because of this mismatch between supply and demand, we think that the housing prices will remain strong in the absence of an economic shock. So that's one point. In terms of the overall economy, I mentioned on average we expect mortgage payments to go up by 30 to 40%. So that means that money is not going to be available for consumers to spend on other areas of the economy. So that's something that we really need to think about in terms of that impact on overall economic activity. And why CMHC is so focused on supply is we need to create more affordable housing options for Canadians. It's, I mentioned Canada has one of the highest levels of household debt because of our high house prices. We need to think about readjusting the supply of housing so we have cheaper housing options for homeowners, but we need to also have more rental housing. So there's more choice for Canadians so that they can have rental options at cheaper prices as well.
I want to unpack this mortgage renewal cliff a little bit. Sure. Because you mentioned that once the higher payments hit, you don't expect the housing market necessarily to fall a whole lot, if at all. Is that because there won't be many or any forced sales from people having to adjust to these higher rates?
So our perspective is that this interest rate shock it's going to be very painful for certain households, for sure. But in the absence, we have very strong employment levels. In the absence of an economic shock where people lose their jobs, we feel that Canadians will find a way to pay the increased payments. But they will have less money for other types of purchases in the economy.
Right, so sort of distressed people as opposed to distressed sales.
That's right.
But when someone is distressed, they're not spending money on vacations, rrestaurants.
That's correct.
In the community. Will that be enough itself to tip Canada into a recession?
Honestly,
Canada's recession.
Yeah. So I don't think we're willing to say that for sure. Like that's not what we are predicting. What we're saying is that Canadians hold a lot of mortgage debt. Interest rates are going to be higher for longer, and that actions need to be made to pay down mortgage balances so that people can accommodate the higher mortgage payments that are to come.
Does the Bank of Canada need to start lowering interest rates to get ahead of this mortgage renewal cliff?
I can't comment on the role of Bank of Canada, but the Bank of Canada is making all efforts to reduce inflation. That's the number one priority. High levels of inflation have very adverse impacts on the economy. We've made great progress in addressing inflation. And I think, I think in some ways the very, very low levels of interest rates that existed from the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 for the last 10 or 15 years, that is not the normal in terms of interest rates. And I think we're in the process of adjusting to an environment of interest rates that are higher than what they have during the last 15 years.
The last topic I want to touch on in regards to mortgages. There's been a proliferation of very long amortizing mortgages on the balance sheets of banks across Canada. Often these are variable rate mortgages with fixed payment structures. So you see amortizations up to 75, 80 years. It's drawn a lot of criticism that essentially people are not paying down their principal at all. They're just transferring interest payments to the bank, and it looks like they're going to be doing that for the rest of their lives. I'm curious about how you see this and if this is a problem that can be addressed.
So I believe that the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada has made some public statements about the nature of these products and how we need to really look at whether these products should be reformed or changed in the future. So I think I would be very supportive of that. In terms of CMHC's book, we have 85% of our book is fixed, 15% is variable. Of the 15% that's variable, there's probably about 20% with negative amortizations. And so we view this as a temporary phenomenon. We see lenders working very actively with mortgage holders to make lump sum payments, to readjust the terms so that when the mortgages renew, that they can get back onto a more normal amortization schedule. And I think that's what we need to aim for as a country.
Should these kind of variable fixed payment mortgages, should they be eliminated in Canada?
I'm not willing to go there. I think we need to look at them and study them in a more considered way. And I think I heard a previous panelist say that it's not normal to have the rate of interest rate increase that we've had in the last 18 months. So I think it's a very specific situation that we have this long amortization problem. But I think, as we go through situations like this, it's always good to look at the products that exist and see whether changes need to be made to ensure the soundness of the financial system going forward.
Okay, Romy, that was a great conversation. Thanks so much for being here. We'll end it there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Harry. Appreciate it.
to take a quick break. So please feel free to stretch your legs, get some coffee, and please, if you could be back in your seats for more stimulating conversation around 10:30. Thank you.
We're actually right on time.
Okay, yeah, well, I was just looking and I was like,
the name? What's the name? See the curtains hanging in the window in the evening of a Friday night. Little light is shining through the window, lets me know everything's alright. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. See the paper laying on the sidewalk, a little music from the house next door. So I walk on up to the doorstep, through the screen and across the floor. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. Sweet days of summer, the jasmine's in bloom. July is dressed up and playing her tune, and I come home from a hard day's work, and you're waiting there, not a care in the world. See the smile waiting in the kitchen, food cooking on the plates for two. Feel the arms that reach out to hold me in the evening when the day is through. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind.
take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Take your seats. The program is about to begin. welcome to the stage Jim Hopkins, Assistant Deputy Minister of Provincial Treasury, British Columbia, Stephen Thompson, Executive Director, Capital Markets, Treasury Board and Finance, Government of Alberta, and Elizabeth Wallace, Senior Manager, Funding and Foreign Exchange, Capital Markets Division, Ontario Financing Authority, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Paula Sambo.
Good.
Hello, thank you for having us. So the new reality seems to be higher for longer interest rates. How does this change your funding strategy? Of course, this environment is squeezing borrowers at a time that you need more liquidity. But at the same time, you have to be sensitive to the way you approach, your clients. You can be a bull in a china shop. So I'd like to hear from you, your strategies. If you'd like to start, Elizabeth.
Sure. So our funding strategy is informed by the interest rate environment in which we're operating, but really each year we have somewhere generally between $30 and $40 billion worth of funding to do. We put together a borrowing plan. Part of the interest rate influence that might be incorporated into that borrowing plan will be sort of a fixed floating mix, so we might adjust that. But really, our overall funding strategy, it's not to say we ignore interest rate in that environment, but we are issuing 30 to 40 billion a year. When you take out times when markets just aren't conducive, when there's blackout periods, when there's economic releases, when there's uncertainties that destabilize the market, there's really not a lot of open weeks in which to get an issue into the market. And so we are generally sort of doing $750 million to $1 billion in any good week, just in order to get all of our funding done in a timely manner. So with that, we're really conscious of keeping a very, sort of a very consistent approach to the markets. We don't mean to confuse investors. We like them to understand how we operate and what they can expect from us. And so while we'll adjust things at the margin because of the interest rate environment we're in, we're really focused on making sure investors understand what we're doing in the market, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, when we might be doing it. And we're very driven by investor interest. And with that, we feel that that allows us to access the market without having too many parameters around us that limit what we can do if there's an opportunity. So we're very opportunity driven. Investors show us their interest. We try to respond the best we can to that. And that is really kind of our overall strategy, is to really focus on investors. Everything else kind of comes behind that. And to be consistent and to be thoughtful in how we approach the market, not bring too much to market when it's not appropriate, to feed the market when it is appropriate, and to not deviate too greatly from how you think of us and how you know us, and to build large liquid issues that are readily tradable so that you can get both into our debt and out of our debt somewhat seamlessly. I hope that answers your question.
Of course it did. Would you like to add anything, Steve?
No, sure I would. And all of the provinces in Canada really rely on Ontario to set a benchmark that we can price off of. We have the luxury of being much more opportunistic than Ontario. We don't have to come every week. We can time the market a little more effectively, simply because we don't have the pressure.
It's a good time for you to say if she's being a good benchmark or not, right?
They do a fantastic job. The liquidity in Canadian provincial bonds is unparalleled in the bond universe, I think. You can see 30-year provincial debt trading in a very, very tight spreads across all of the provinces. Some of the smaller ones, your Newfoundlands, your Nova Scotias, maybe not as much. But the debt trades incredibly well, and that's all based on the foundation that Ontario builds for us. That's the nicest thing I'll say about Ontario for the rest of the week. but much like Elizabeth, I mean, as much as rates are higher than they have been in the past decade, really, they're not historically high. You know, the interest rate crunch that the federal government, for example, is feeling right now is not something that we bear in Alberta. You know, we've been issuing long bonds for decades. We've been prudently building a curve, you know, 5s, 10s long, so that all of the bonds trade easily, and we're really not feeling the pinch. Yeah, it costs us a bit more to raise on the margin, but it's not something that's going to hit our fiscal balance at all.
Anything to add, Jim?
Well, I just echo a lot of what Elizabeth and Steve have said, and add, I mean, the basic mantra for any good borrowing program is price, size, and time for success with the investor base. And that doesn't change just because we're in a different interest rate environment. And as Elizabeth said, you don't want to confuse the financial community by all of a sudden appearing different. It doesn't, there's no need to do that. And interest rates, as Steve said, really, they're not all that high if you look at it on a historical basis. I think what is different, though, perhaps, is that in this environment, borrowing programs are bigger. There's a bit more competition. And in an environment where there's volatility, it's closing, well, it's presenting fewer and narrower windows through which to issue. So that does become an issue sometimes, is trying to get your, in a nice way, get your elbow in so that, you know, you appear. And in Canada, we have a very good borrowing protocol among provinces where you don't hear of collisions. And so that's not just a coincidence. It's done by good protocol and prior discussions that we've had on this very matter. But that competition is an issue, and you have to be nimble. You have to be prepared to jump through those windows when they present themselves. We're very much dependent on data releases now. So you have all these sort of mini blackout periods when, you know, there's some data event and all of a sudden we all have to freeze, wait for that to pass, or a central bank's going to make an announcement and we all notionally freeze again. So I think maybe the difference is that you know, it may be issuing less frequently in larger size. So the province of BC this year would be an example of that. We've done $2 globals, each $2.25 billion, you know, and that fitted right, and it allowed us to sort of make good inroads on the $10 billion we borrowed year to date by being able to go bigger. And you know, these issues, like a $3 billion equivalent Canadian would be, for BC, would be 6 bond issues. So there's a lot of, you avoid those sort of traffic issues. So this would, there are a number of other things, but that would be the main thing, I think, that you just have to, but don't appear differently and confuse investors by all of a sudden being somebody different than you really are.
And you've been, yes. And it seems like a lot of challenge, you know, all this volatility, like the windows closing quickly. How do you deal with diversification, for example? Are you seeing more openings in the offshore market, in the indoor market? What are your successes? You mentioned a bit about your successes outside of Canada, but how does that compare versus what you're doing in Canada, if you'd like to start?
Well, I mean, this year the province has done, of the $10 billion we borrowed, 65% has been done in either euro format or these dollar deals I just mentioned. So it has been busy for BC. We are drawn into those markets, though, by competitive economics. So we're not really, we don't set targets that, you know, this year we will do this much offshore. But this year, economics were kind to the province. And I'll give my capital markets team great credit by being nimble, you know, and sort of taking the initiative to get themselves in so that they could seize on those good economics, because they disappear as quickly as they're there. They can also disappear. So that's a big part of that strategy.
Is your team as nimble as his?
Oh, we're much more nimble, actually. we're better looking and we're quicker. No, look, in volatility, that's where the opportunity comes from, right? And without some interest rate volatility, you don't find arbitrage opportunities. And that typically is what drives us offshore. One of the interesting things I found is because the rates are higher, but the curve is also shifting shape. And that's actually allowed, we've seen a lot of inbounds. We haven't done any transactions yet, but in terms of doing some structured product in the Canadian sector, we've had opportunities come there. And so we kind of leverage the volatility to our advantage. And as Jim says, if there's an opportunity to save money going offshore, we will take that. We maintain multiple global platforms just to enable us to do that. So Aussie, euro, dollars, whatever. But I mean, if we're being honest on arbitrage, we can always, every issuer will claim savings on offshore issuance. And you can do that because you're comparing something you did to something you didn't do. So it's a bit theoretical, and it's kind of a vanity play. I think the important thing for the offshore issuance, from our perspective, is access to markets at all time. I mean, the critical nature of provincial funding means that we need access to cash at all times. If we don't pay doctors, they don't come to work, and that kind of matters, right? There's no situation where we cannot access cash, and that's why we go offshore. If we can save money and brag about it and do bigger issues, yeah, sure, we'll do that. But it's really about getting cash in the door.
I would just echo Steve's comments in that you want to keep as access to a variety of markets because there's no telling which markets will work and not work in any given time frame. So you try and keep your options open. As Jim mentioned, you want to be agile, nimble, whatever adjective we're going to use to describe that. So when opportunities arise, you can seize them. For Ontario, we're also taking into consideration to some extent, we're trying to diversify our investor base when we're going to foreign markets. Sometimes we're looking at terms that we wouldn't normally do in the domestic market. So in the dollar market, we can sometimes go a little bit shorter, which is something we don't really take part in the Canadian dollar market. But the opening and closing of windows is very tricky. Markets have been extremely volatile. We're very used to, in the domestic market, we can start and finish an issue in 12 minutes. So it's a quick thing. And I think that always surprises people how quickly that whole process unfolds from when we pick up the phone and call a lead on a deal for us and we've papered it and sent it off to documentation. So that kind of speed is a little bit exhilarating and in some ways kind of influences our thought process. So when we look at going into an international market to do some funding and we're talking about a 24-hour window, given sort of the backdrop of volatility, be it geopolitical, be it market-driven, it's not that we're uncomfortable, but it means that we pause and think about the fact that we're going to be out there for 24 hours. And a lot can change in 24 hours in this particular time, like in the times we're living in at the moment. So we are trying to do some foreign issuance this year. We only did one foreign issue last year, and there were a number of circumstances that conspired to make that so. I think if any of you were able to look at our website and see the video that our CEO released once our fall economic statement was out, he very clearly pointed to international markets as somewhere we'd be looking to go for funding. That being said, since that fall economic statement came out, we funded, as of this morning, $7 billion in the Canadian domestic market. So when we need to go and get money, we can go, we can be very quick, we can get size, and it's very cost effective for us in Canadian dollars. So that's very attractive. And so when we're looking at foreign markets, like they also have to have some appeal for us. We have to, getting arbitrage is really not on the table most times in some of the bigger current, like in euros or in US dollars. But we try and look for a reasonableness test when we're going to those markets. Does this make sense for us? But you kind of have to weigh that up. We have these Canadian investors who have been solidly behind the Ontario credit through COVID, through the last year, through this week, through last week. And when you go to a foreign market and you're willing to pay up quite a few basis points to a number of investors that aren't your bread and butter investor group, you want to think about how often you're doing that and what the impact or what the opinions of those investors in the Canadian domestic market are when they see you willing to do that for an investor who's not walking side by side with you day in, day out, week in, week out. So we're weighing that up as well. We're trying to make sure everybody's looked after, including ourselves, that we're getting our funding program done. But there's a lot of moving parts when you consider going into the foreign market, and the volatility underlying it is certainly part of it. It's both a good thing and a bad thing. And then there's all these other considerations, plus about 1,000 more that the three of us could probably name. So I'll leave it at that.
Talking about good and bad things, I wanted to switch the conversation a bit to ESG, like to what you've done in that space and what you plan on doing on that space. And I think it would be convenient to start with you, Alberta.
Happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, on the ESG space, we're not likely to do, you know, a named bond program. We're not going to do a green bond program. We're probably not going to do transition bonds. It doesn't mean that the ESG space isn't alive and well in Alberta. I mean, you cannot talk about greenhouse gas reductions or you know, carbon neutrality without talking to your largest emitters in Canada. And the only progress really that's been made in Canada on emissions reduction is in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Those are important things, and those are provincial responsibilities, and those are funded through our fiscal program. In terms of you know, a use of proceeds bonds program, our view really is that it eats away at the liquidity of our core funding. And you know, we've tried to be responsible in our approach to markets. We've tried to build benchmarks. We've promoted liquidity in our name. And that's actually becoming more challenging for us, as you know, we're blessed fiscally this year particularly, and then and, you know, into our forecast. We're in a position we're actually paying down debt. We're the only province in Canada reducing its debt load right now as part of our fiscal plan. So my focus in the Treasury is to keep the bonds that we have, the stock that we have, liquid and tradable. And I think putting a use of proceeds program in place would eat away at that. But you know, we're not climate change deniers. We believe ESG is not a four-letter word. You know, we believe in the space. I just don't believe in funding it as a program. And it's not to criticize the work of Ontario in that space and Quebec, both is fantastic. But they have a debt stock that allows them to have liquidity in their green bond programs. We don't have that.
Okay. And just a follow-up question to that, you know, how do you think about like what happened on Monday with your premier invoking?
Did something happen Monday?
I mean, does that change the risk perception of your province and your?
We haven't seen that. We do. I mean, it's important to remember. You know, we talked a lot to foreign investors, but a lot of Canadians don't really realize the rather unique constitutional structure of Canada and the disproportionate responsibilities of provinces. And you know, under the Canadian Constitution, provinces have fiscal autonomy across the board in terms of taxation. We're responsible for education. We're responsible for healthcare. We are a socialist nation, and we're proud of it. But coming with that, like the whole point of the sovereignty, the Sovereignty Within the United Canada Act, is simply to remind the federal government of their responsibilities under the Constitution, and it provides really just a signal that, you know, Alberta is asserting its rights under the Constitution. And where we see federal creep into our responsibilities, all we've done is call them out on it. I mean, we haven't really done much. Now, that is very complicated when you're talking to international investors. You're describing the Canadian Constitution. It's really not the greatest start to a conversation with somebody who wants to buy your bonds. But it just comes back to pricing, right?
Yeah.
So if we can explain it in a reasonable fashion and simply say, look, whatever you think of the politics of it, the fiscal strength of Alberta is solid. You know, it's far superior to that of the Canadian government. I mean, if I'm worried about credit ratings in Canada, I'm worried about Canada. I'm not worried about Alberta.
And what about you, Jim? Like, what have you done in the ESG space, and what do you plan on doing going forward?
Yeah, our approach is much like Steve's and Alberta's. We have fully embraced ESG and have done for a long while. So ESG values, ESG outcomes are onboarded by the government. And our approach, though, is, and we think it's actually got the biggest impact, is to report as an issuer as exactly what are our ESG credentials. Show us what your track record is and report regularly. And this is will be our approach. We started last year with a government report on ESG. This fall, BC Hydro, it's our hydroelectric utility, you probably know, they just released their own ESG report. So that transparency, we think, is actually really what investors should be, and really, you know, to have that information so that they can do their risk analysis is really what this whole ESG policy change in the capital markets is about. We're less inclined to believe that a bond, a use of proceeds bond in itself, actually moves the needle for the quality of life. It really was what decision did they make in the space, that transit system, that's affordable housing complex, whatever it was. Who is this issuer? You know, and that, I think, is what investors should hold issuers to account, less focused on bonds. I will, though, say, without being, we're in the same boat as Alberta. We have a smaller program. We don't have the luxury of being able to fracture our liquidity into sidebar use of proceeds bonds. So we don't have that luxury that Ontario has. But anyway, this is our approach, and I think that it's that we'd like to be held to account as an issuer, that we're ESG based, and that's you'll see more reports come from the province along those lines to sort of echo that approach.
That makes sense. You are in a very different boat. Would you like to talk about your province a bit?
I am in a different boat in Ontario, but I think the consensus or converging message here is that we're all on the same page, and we're all focused on ESG, and we're all trying to do what we can in that space. And the method we choose may be quite different, but it doesn't mean we're not all kind of driving down the same road, if you will. For Ontario, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, we have the largest green bond program in Canadian dollars. We've issued the most green bonds in Canadian dollars at 13 for a total of $15 billion, some of which has matured already, so that's not all outstanding at the moment. We've had a green bond framework in place since 2014, so we were quite early into the market. We're going to continue doing that. It is our intention to issue 2 labeled bonds each fiscal year, and this year will be no different. The one thing that is starting to percolate is we are working on a new framework, because our existing framework has been around for a while, and because it was put in place when the market was really in its infancy, a lot of change has occurred. And while we've tried to track and make sure that our framework stays aligned, we feel now we need to just open it up completely and refurbish it, if you will, and then show it back out to you when we're ready. So that's what we're expecting to do in early 2024. But for the time being, we're still operating under our existing framework, which is quite simple, but still seems to address the need. When you think about a provincial issuer of labeled bonds or a provincial issuer in general, I mean, the thing about us, and it's been alluded to here, is that as a group, a lot of the money we're raising is for healthcare, is for education. Like, those are 2 top-line items for all of us. It's not anything to do with the geography. It's the downloading of that responsibility to each of us. And so if you are interested in thinking about where your dollars are going, whether it's a labeled bond, which we do, or not a labeled bond, really those are the things you're funding, and if that's what's important to you, then I would suggest buy more provincial bonds.
Sounds good. We don't have much time left, but I'd like to ask the 3 of you quickly if you're doing any changes to your hedging strategy.
We always have an active hedging program. We may have lifted it a little bit since we've gone into this interest rate environment. what all I'd say about it. It's not dramatic, but there has been a little bit more activity. We think it does probably merit that attention, but it's not a big change.
What about you?
We're just being a little more opportunistic in terms of timing our deals. Hedging's a bit of a curse as a province. If you get it right, no one cares, and if you get it wrong, they hang you. So we really just avoid the space, to be honest.
I don't judge you. What about you?
Our hedging strategy has, I think, evolved where all of our foreign issuance is essentially now hedged back into Canadian dollars. That has happened over the last sort of 12-month period. And we're using and we do a lot of hedging in and around our domestic issues. We have a whole debt management team that is active in that regard. So our hedging program, I would say, is kind of status quo. We're always monitoring what we can do in markets, what we can overlay, what we can change in terms of our fixed floating mix. That's just part of the business we all do. And so we'll continue to do that and behave according to what it is the objectives we have for our programs going forward.
I should say, Paula, when I mentioned hedging, I was talking about interest rate hedges.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whenever we go offshore into these other currencies, we're always putting on cross-currency hedges to bring it back into Canada.
Yes.
That's no different. But.
Yeah. So we're up. And I'd like to thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening to us.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Rod Balkwill, Executive Director, Treasury Management Branch, Government of Saskatchewan, and Nicoletta Oprea, Director, Capital Markets, Province of Manitoba, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Derek Decloé.
Thank you both for being here. Saskatchewan and Manitoba are the Canadian breadbasket, the heartland of the nation, and huge resource producers and important actually for the world food supply, both of your provinces. You actually have got economically a number of similarities, also some differences. Both provinces in quite good fiscal health at the moment, high labor participation and so on. So there's sort of a, I guess just setting the table a bit. Maybe you could each speak about the outlook for the economy for your regions, maybe for Western Canada more broadly, and what are you thinking about as we head into 2024? And Rod, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Derek. You're exactly right. Both provinces, Saskatchewan is a producer of agricultural products. Farming is in its DNA since its inception. So grains, canola oil, which is a product that was introduced in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and introduced to the world and has become a $5 billion export to China and other parts of the world. And also expanding into the plant-based proteins like lentils, peas, and so forth, and exporting those. So as you can imagine, it's a fairly stable economy. There's significant resources as well, natural resources beneath the ground. So the big three, we call it in Saskatchewan anyway, is potash, uranium, and oil and gas. That kind of balances out the agricultural swings. So ag has its own cycle. Generally, each of those commodities can have their own cycle. Sometimes they go all together, like in the 2000s, where they all ran up in price. But generally, it does provide some buffer to the general GDP growth in the province, and does help us keep those unemployment numbers quite low.
Nicoletta, Manitoba, what is the view from the center of the country?
Thank you. What we have seen is that the Manitoba economy has remained resilient in the first half of this year. What we are seeing is that the economic indicators are trending up, however, at a much slower pace than what we saw in 2022. What we're seeing is that sales from retail and from wholesale and manufacturer sectors are continuing to increase at a steady pace. Now, because of this, the economic outlook for the current fiscal year has been revised higher from what we've forecasted at budget time. So what we're seeing now in terms of nominal GDP growth for the province for current year is an increase to 3% growth from 2.2 is what we forecasted at budget time. Now, we've talked today about higher inflation, higher interest rates, and the uncertainty that comes with that. So we have revised our outlook for 2024, and our GDP growth for next fiscal year has been revised lower to 2.8% on the nominal side, and a modest growth of 0.8% for real GDP. In terms of the labor market, I mean, we are seeing a strong labor market, employment gains of about 2.2% for the current year. But again, we're forecasting that to moderate next year with about just under 1% increase. Unemployment as well, on the back of that, we're forecasting that to increase for next fiscal year. But Manitoba is among one of the most diversified economies in Canada, and we have generally fared better when there are downturns in global economy.
Thank you. So let's turn to the investment side. And in particular, as you mentioned, we have a high-ish inflation environment. Inflation appears to be receding, but still kind of uncomfortably high. And also, at least broadly in Canada, a slowing growth profile. So, and obviously, a huge volatility in rates in the past little while. So, how do these factors present challenges for you in your financing strategies? How are you thinking of them as you plan how you're going to finance operations and capital in the years ahead? And we'll start with you.
So our debt management strategy focuses on building just liquidity in the domestic market. Our focus has been to build benchmark sizes in the 10 and 30-year part of the curve. And I think that has served our program really well in this environment of higher volatility, because what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that investors are looking to invest in more liquid names. Now, our strategy also focuses on minimizing borrowing costs by accessing international markets. So the province does have set up a US dollar program registered with the SEC. We have a European medium-term note program as well as an Australian program. We've done in some years as much as 40% of our borrowing in international markets, and we always look for opportunity to access international markets. We were recently, this past July, we were in the U.S. market, and we were able to issue a 10-year, $1 billion global debenture. And our focus is going to be, or the goal is to be in the U.S. market once a year.
Rod, your view on the financing challenges of this particular environment?
Yeah, well, I'll just say we've endeavor to try to have liquid benchmarks as well when we're issuing bonds. Our challenge has been in the last couple of years that we're with surpluses, the ability to build up those benchmarks has been difficult. So our borrowing programs were smaller. We think we'll revert to more borrowing in the coming years as our revenues normalize. But speaking to the interest rate environment right now, it is, and in the inflation environment, it does pose a few little good things and bad things for governments. Off the start, I think a lot of provincial governments, and we included, were experiencing more revenues. Inflation was impacting the prices of goods and services. Consumption taxes are based on on those prices. So we did see an uptick in consumption taxes. We have natural resource revenues that are based on the prices of those, and they're based on the prices in US dollars. More revenues from those. But generally, I would say it's probably a net negative. It's been a long time since we've experienced inflation like this, a very long time. And generally, it does slow down consumption and incomes and tax revenues that go along with that. So it's been a challenge. And then on the other side, of course, just fiscally speaking, the expense side starts to rise. So we've got collective bargaining agreements with major employee groups underway. Capital expenditures are definitely going up. Everybody has experienced that. So, that's not where I make decisions, where I work, but it feeds into our amount of borrowing. So we have to be ready to issue in a manner that lowers the risk for the province, including exposure to continuing rising interest rates. And for us, that means generally borrowing longer to lock in those rates, because we do have somewhat of a volatile revenue stream on our resources.
We heard Stéfane Marion earlier in the first session of the day talk about maybe 100 basis points of a decline in the policy rate next year. I mean, obviously, plenty of headwinds in the Canadian economy, as we've been hearing all morning. Is it tempting to borrow more short in an environment where it looks highly likely that short rates are already coming down, but they might actually fall pretty sharply next year? How do you guys think about that? Because you both said here you tend to go further out in the curve.
I think it is tempting. It's also sort of dangerous for a major borrower to kind of make calls like that. The consensus isn't always correct, and so it's better to balance things off. On the margins, I think it seems like you could build a story for borrowing in 3 to 5 year sector from an issuer perspective, and you could build a good thesis from an investor perspective to buy bonds in that part of the curve, because it's, you may see the most improvement if there are those cuts that happen. But generally, we build a plan, we sort of stick to it, and then the last 2 years also, where investors have been more vocal about what they need in terms of term to maturity and other features. So, I guess the short way of saying is we don't really want to make too huge a call on where rates are going, but stick to something that's balanced and diversified.
I mean, we do have a short-term borrowing program. We have a weekly treasury bill auction. We have a promissory note program. But we've used these programs mainly for cash management purposes, as well to manage our fixed floating split for our debt portfolio. And we're going to continue to use it for these purposes. What we want is to reduce that volatility in public debt expense, and keeping with our strategy of issuing in the 10 and 30 year part of the curve, it is going to help us reduce that volatility. Now, if we look at the 5 year part of the curve as being shorter, given our focus. So traditionally, we have left that part of the curve to issue in the US market, just because the arbitrage has worked better for us. This year, like I mentioned earlier, we issued in the 10 years. So that leaves space in our debt maturity profile to take a look at the 5 year part of the curve in the domestic market if there is a need and if there's an opportunity to issue there.
So you mentioned, used a good word, vocal. Investors have been more vocal. This was, you guys are repeat attendees here, because you did one of these panels last year. And I think at the time you said that there were some indications that given the rate volatility at the time, there were some buyers sitting on the sidelines. So what are investors being vocal about right now? And are some of them just sort of waiting to see if rates settle? Nicoletta.
Yeah, what we're hearing from investors is that they're looking for that liquidity, for liquid names when they decide to invest, hence our focus on that. I do think investors are on the sideline with our international programs. I mean, especially the Australian program. We haven't been in that market for about 2 years now. And when we go to international markets, it is arbitrage based. So the volatility, when we look at the ARBs, the volatility makes that ARBs move very quickly. So we have to move quickly as well. But what we're seeing is that when the ARBs work, the investor may not be there because of the volatility and because they're on the sideline just waiting to see if that volatility is going to subside.
Yeah, and I think the 3 years of bear market in bonds has kind of changed the landscape somewhat. Generally, and I'm not sure, but it's a new phenomena for bond investors, and so I think they're looking for liquidity, and they're looking for specific terms to fit a need. Say if it's in a structured type portfolio, but you feel it. The books compared to 2 or 3 years ago, or even during the pandemic, there were we funded a lot during the pandemic, and there were buyers. Now it just seems quite a bit harder. I also look to the fact that central banks are sellers, not buyers anymore. So that's a big swing in terms of supply, and governments are borrowing as well. So it's I don't know if it's it's just the investors they're. When you have a bear market in bonds, the whole bond portfolio gets smaller, so there's not as much available to go around as well. So we have to be attuned to what investors are looking for and be nimble. And I think, for example, borrowing offshore when the arbitrage is not in your favor is probably going to be becoming more of a necessary thing for provinces, or for this province to do anyway.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a good opportunity for you to speak about when you, because the Canadian dollar market can meet most of Saskatchewan's needs, but how you think about and when you go to other currencies and the U.S. dollar market. What's the strategy?
Well, it's a new strategy for us. We issued $1 billion in June of 2022, but before that it had been 1994 since we had entered in the U.S. market. So. Our strategy when we developed it was to get our total outstanding to about 25% of our debt, and we're at 5% now. So, after we did that dollar deal, our revenues increased dramatically because of commodity price increases as a result of the war in Ukraine and with Russia, and we didn't need to borrow again. But going forward, it's go into the dollar market. We refreshed our EMTN program, and to get to 25%, that means we have to do more than 25% of our annual borrowing in those markets. And looking forward, between refinancing existing debt from the pandemic, pretty aggressive capital spending plans, that we'll have enough bonds to meet that, to get to 30 or 40% in international markets and still access the Canadian market.
Right. You did that U.S. dollar deal several months ago. Any plans to go back to Euro, Aussie, or anything else sort of on the horizon for Manitoba?
So we don't have set targets for international issuance. When we do issue, it is arbitrage based. So we look at levels compared to where we can issue in the domestic market. And given the size of our program, there is capacity to do that in the domestic market. But we do like to diversify our investor base. We also look at international markets to minimize our borrowing cost and to take pressure off the domestic market. So there is no strict targets for international issuance, but when the opportunity does present We do take a look at, if it fits with our maturity schedule, and if it is, if we're able to swap that back to Canadian. That's another important factor for us. Any international issuance that we do, we swap all of that back to Canada, so we don't take on any foreign exchange exposure, and we need to be able to have access to the swap market and do it on a cost-effective way.
In Saskatchewan is the same, right? You don't play currency risk, really.
No, we do. Correct, we don't play currency risk. But there's some interesting things there, and we probably won't ever play currency risk, but I touched on it earlier. Our revenues on non-renewable resources are based on companies that sell in US dollars. So when their profits go up, it can be because the US dollar was stronger. So there's some hedges in there that could, natural hedges, if we ever borrowed unhedged to small amounts, that we might consider that, but it would be on the margin. It's just risky.
You made an interesting point about a few minutes ago about competition and demand and how it has changed. How much interaction is there between yourselves and your federal counterparts on there, because I mean obviously they have a massive borrowing program. It's more oriented towards the short-term end of the curve, but there's still competition. What are those discussions like, or do they consult with you?
They do. There's a great relationship with the provinces and our federal counterparts at finance. It's open, lots of dialogue. The issues are not significant when they do come up, but there's more of an exchange of ideas, and probably the larger provinces would be better to speak to what that relationship gets like. I think those are ones that are maybe more impactful in discussions because they have larger borrowing programs, but I think the federal government has been supportive of and is involved with the provincial borrowing side of things, and so that relationship is, in my opinion, very good.
One feature of you're blessed with resources, but the resources can also bring revenue volatility, as mentioned, and both your provinces have been blessed in recent years, but that won't necessarily continue. So how do you mitigate that kind of revenue volatility risk? Is there something that you can do, in your roles to help smooth things out?
Well, I mean, revenue collection of the taxes that we collect, the revenue on, it is all based on where the economic outlook is and forecasted based on that. We have included in our budget contingencies for revenue risk, and we will continue to include that just to mitigate against the risk. I mean, in terms of the budgetary process, and as we're going through that right now, we do look at forecasts and how to best include that part of the budgetary process, because what we are seeing on the revenue side with personal and corporate income tax, due to the higher inflation slowdown in economy, that is forecasted to come in lower than where we had them forecasted a budget. So we just, and that's, like you said, it's not just Manitoba, it is other jurisdictions as well. So it's part of the budgetary process that we include contingencies and look at economic forecast.
Let's talk briefly about ESG, and in the case of Saskatchewan, you do have an energy grid that's based on natural gas and coal primarily, and there's a longer term plan to transition to cleaner sources in part. Tell us about the financing plans for that. Is there a consideration of a transition bond or green bond type of product as part of that?
Right, correct. So the current plan, there's about 80% comes from coal or natural gas. Coal is about 30% of the grid, and obviously legacy, those are the resources the province has, and those will be phased out by 2030. as part of an agreement with the federal government, and replaced with natural gas and solar, wind, import hydro, to get to 50% renewables at that time in 2030. Those gas plants are obviously cleaner than coal, but they will need to be replaced too. The target for the province is to have that completed by 2050. And to do that, natural gas, those plants that have just been built, their useful life will run out, and act as a bridge towards small modular reactors, which are nuclear reactors that are more like 350 megawatts rather than the 1,000. There's an MOU between Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba to develop these, and one's being built now in Darlington and in Ontario, and those would be rolled out. So we've got 2 sites picked in Saskatchewan for them, but we wouldn't start building those till 2029. And they're about $6 billion each rather than $600 million. So $12 billion, kind of like what the minister in Quebec had said about $100 billion. Ours is more like 10 to 15 billion. So financing is yet to be determined, but all those sources that he mentioned, we have this power company, but it might not be able to, it may be decided that it doesn't finance at all. It may be decided that it is, but there would be private partnerships, Canada Infrastructure Bank, other areas that would help with that financing, because it is an important transition, and it probably carries some of that same national scope, which is the federal government's desire to green the whole grid, and I think that's probably one of the targets is to have federal involvement in that transition.
Is there anything we should know about Manitoba Hydro's sort of capital plans that would affect your outlook for financing?
So Manitoba Hydro just recently finished some large capital programs. And there is no plans right now to start any large capital programs, but Hydro did release integrated the IRP back in August, which takes a look at the opportunities going forward in terms of supplying energy to not just Manitoba, but other opportunities that are out there. Currently, the energy that's supplied by Manitoba Hydro, 97% of that is electric clean energy. Another about 2% is wind energy that's being supplied. So fairly green, and they're looking at what the future looks like in the next 10 to 20 years.
And with that, we've run out of time. But thank you so much, Rod and Nicoletta, for your time and for joining us today.
Please welcome to the stage Christine Ducray, Chief Financial Officer at TransLink, Ed Hankins, Treasury Office Director and Deputy Treasurer at the Region Municipality of York, and Peter Urbank, CEO of Municipal Finance Authority of British Columbia, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Paula Sambo.
Hello, thank you for having us again, or at least me again. At a time that yields are so good everywhere, everyone is looking for good assets. And I know that Canadian municipalities are highly sought after. Could you elaborate on some of the difference between US and Canadian municipals? And what are the differences, if any, when it comes to Canada and Canadian municipal issues that impact your credit? If you could start, Ed.
Okay, thanks. The major difference that I can see right off is that U.S. municipalities tend to issue tax-exempt debentures or bonds, whereas the Canadian municipalities are all more like, I'll say, more like corporates, where They're fully taxable. They tend to be, the larger ones tend to be more like bullet bonds and so forth. And that has a difference, I think, in terms of even the markets. I think it's a retail market, I think more in the US, just because of the fact that they are tax exempt, whereas I think in Canada they're more sold institutionally and so forth to banks and so forth. In terms of the credit, I think there's a lot of differences in credit. I think it's a different, I should also mention that most of the larger municipalities in Canada do have at least AA or AAA ratings. So I think the credit, why that credit is there's several reasons. I think one of them has to do with stability of our revenue sources. We don't do things like sales tax. That's not usually part of our revenue. We don't, the taxes, the property taxes that we do tend to be very stable. We don't have a fixed mill rate. We tend to have mill rates that get readjusted as the economy goes. So if you have a good year, a good economic year versus a poor economic year, you see that we're still bringing in the same amount of revenue. Other things that we have, I think that are notable, we don't have equivalent in Canada of Chapter 9, which I think is that municipalities in Canada do not go bankrupt or cannot go bankrupt. We also have a very strong regulatory regime in Canada, mostly done through the provinces, that does limit what we can or cannot do, and it provides a lot of investor safeguards.
Would you like to weigh in, Peter?
Sure. I think Ed went through many of the differences. The one thing I'd say is that we have a much smaller market, municipal bond market in Canada in terms of the amount outstanding, and that's because we issue really general obligation bonds, as Ed mentioned. You can borrow, local governments, regions, hospitals issue a lot of revenue bonds in the States, and it's a huge market. It's a $4 trillion market versus roughly a $50 billion market in Canada. And then the other thing I'll say is there's three different ways municipalities access the markets in Canada. Through a pool, like through Municipal Finance Authority in British Columbia, where they're borrowing through an infrastructure bank directly, so the way that, say, Region of York or TransLink or City of Toronto would issue directly to the market, or in some cases the province. So for example, in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, the province issues, and then they lend to the local government. So there's three main ways that they access the markets.
And, talking about transit, like Canada's largest cities have been focused on building, expanding, or at least operating like large transit systems. Why is this important, and what have you done, and what are your plans regarding transit? Like, has COVID and the current economical environment impacted any of it?
Yeah, definitely in the Metro Vancouver area, transit is very important. We don't have a huge road network. We have the ocean to the west, mountains to the north, the border, US border to the south. So it's extremely important for our economy, for goods movement, and just, moving people around. So during COVID, like every other transit agency in the world, we really suffered from ridership. We're very pleased how it's bounced back, and really we're about 85–90% of pre-COVID levels. We consider it kind of our new normal. So with organizations not going back to work 5 days a week, it really has impacted the travel patterns of our customers. We don't have the high peak times that we used to, and we have increases in the off-peak and weekend travel as well. In some of our regions, we're like 120–125% above pre-COVID levels, so we're really starting to see the crowding again like we were before COVID. As far as projects, we're expanding right now. We're expanding our SkyTrain line into Vancouver, further into Vancouver. We're expanding it from Surrey to Langley, which is 2 municipalities. So it's going to go further out into the valley. So those are underway right now. They started, a number of years ago. The province is actually delivering the SkyTrain lines, and then we will operate it, and we have integration plans and whatnot. But there's a lot of upgrades, ordering new SkyTrain cars, upgrading the power the power system, building new operations and maintenance center. So lots of stuff on the go, but that's not enough. We have to look at the next phase. We work really closely with our 21 mayors of the municipalities with which we serve, and they've actually approved what we call Access for Everyone plan, which will be the next phase of our projects and our expansion. Funding is an issue still. We do have a large funding gap because of the inflation that we've experienced over the last few years, as well, mainly labor as well. So what we've done to kind of fight that is we've looked at our capital program, we've decreased some of the capital projects without, or delayed them, I should say, without sacrificing safety or reliability. So we've kind of reset that a bit, but we are working with our mayors and the provincial government to find another funding source for us. And it's really important for us to be shovel ready when the funding does come from our senior governments. Like the federal government has a permanent transit fund that is supposed to take place in 2026. We're working with them to try and negotiate it early, but we will be ready when that funding comes for the future expansion. Thank you.
And are you seeing similar trends in York, with
yeah.
rising costs? And
Yeah. Well, I think in terms, let me just talk about what we do. I mean, our municipalities is responsible for both conventional and rapid transit. So, and I think as Christine's talked about, it's really important to build this transit in order to kind of get people around, and, to help relieve congestion and so forth. So it has been a big focus over the last number of years. We have, since COVID has come back, I think, or since COVID, we've seen a lot of our transit ridership come back on there. I think we were at one point, I think we were about 50% of the ridership. I think this year we're going to be probably 90% back to ridership levels. Hopefully next year we'll be at pre-pandemic levels. In terms of what our plans are, I think that was one of the questions. We are very much into into the BRT projects, bus rapid transit projects. I think we're still looking for that senior government funding. These are very expensive programs. I think this is about a $1.8 billion project over 10 years. And we're also very much involved in extensions of subways from the City of Toronto. And this one has been funded. It's just a case of, it's being built through Metrolinx. And that's a $5.6 billion plus, who knows by the time it's finished. We're contributing over $1 billion towards that. Okay.
Thank you. Housing has been one of the biggest issues. You could see, we discussed that in previous panels. Who needs to take the lead in solving this problem, and how does the local government fit into that puzzle? If you'd like to start, Peter.
Sure. Housing is absolutely a big issue, and I know it's been talked about a lot. In particular in Canada, we, I think, have the highest housing prices in the world now relative to our incomes. It's a shared responsibility. So I think really it requires a lot of collaboration and cooperation between different levels of governments. Just to give some context, the federal government sets overall policy for housing for the nation, provides funding for housing, social housing, and other low-income housing, and of course owns CMHC, who you've heard from today at this conference, who's the National Housing Agency, that, whose mandate is to really ensure that everyone has a safe and affordable house throughout the country. Then the province implements those policies, but also creates its own initiatives and policies, and does provide funding as well. And of course, local governments have a very big role to play in planning and zoning regulation. So it requires a lot of cooperation between all these areas of government. It's become a very big political imperative. So politicians at all levels of our government understand how important this is. In BC in particular, maybe I'll just talk about, BC, as Christine just mentioned, is nestled between mountains and the ocean. There is not a lot of land in Canada, in BC in particular, where you can build new housing. So people tend to think Canada's this vast country, so why is housing a problem? The reality is most Canadians live within 100 miles, obviously, of the US. So in BC, there's been for years a big focus. So BC is the fastest growing province in terms of population. I think we're roughly 5.5 million. And just last year, we received 150,000 new immigrants into the province, so it's an acute problem there. There's been many plans. There have been all sorts of initiatives like empty home taxes and other initiatives. Most recently, some of the most interesting I'll just mention are density policies, zoning. So this is a big one. It was done in New Zealand and some other countries a few years ago, where the province has announced that if you have a single-family home, you will automatically be allowed to build 4 to 6 units on that single-family lot. Regulations are coming out around that. So this does pose an issue for local governments because we have to develop the services and the infrastructure to deal with those increased housing units. So it's going to require a lot of cooperation, and absolutely everybody is taking the lead. But it's a complicated file, and it will take, Canada. The crux of this problem came in the 70s and 80s. Canada used to spend a lot of money on social and other forms of housing. They've pulled away and pushed it to the private sector, not for profit. Really hasn't worked. So it'll take probably a decade to fix this problem.
Just a decade? That's optimistic.
Just a decade.
What about you, Ed?
I mean, this is a national problem. I know in Ontario, our provincial government recently announced their targets to build 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years, and they've actually engaged the local municipalities with that by assigning some of them targets. I know York Region, I think, has 150,000 over the next 10 years. I do think that, I don't want to say that, hey, it's just a problem for municipalities. This is a very complex problem. It's not just housing that we need. I think it's affordable housing. That's one of the big issues. I know our council has been very strong on the fact that they have an affordable housing crisis. So we don't need the $1 million homes. We need homes that people new immigrants in particular, can afford. And that's who are driving a lot of these requirements for homes. It's the new immigrants that come to the country that don't necessarily have those financial means to do it. I also think it's also a complex problem too, because it's not just that municipalities need to wave a wand and change the zoning and so forth. It's providing all the infrastructure that's required, the sewers and so forth, water, sewers, transportation. And this is a multi-billion-dollar cost for us, and it takes time. So again, just to kind of reiterate there, it's not just a simple solution, it's a complex solution, and I think, as Peter says, it takes everybody to maybe solve that.
Yes,
and,
for sure.
And part of it's going to be, I think we need more financial resources into it.
And I think it's a bit even more complicated than what you mentioned, because of course it's difficult for immigrants, but with a house going for north of $1 million in the region of Toronto, I think like even people born and raised there are having issues buying house now.
I have 2 children who are sort of in their 20s, and they're all talk about wanting to buy a house, and I think at this point it seems like it's beyond their reach.
Yeah, and would you like to add anything?
Yeah, TransLink's very involved, not in the housing necessarily, but we're a very important part. High density around our transit hubs is very important. The province of BC is introducing legislation around increasing the density and the housing, and where we fit in is working with the province and helping define what that transit hub looks like how far out does it go. We want to make sure that people can walk or cycle to the transit hubs. So we're very involved in those discussions. We also have a real estate development venture that we're involved in for the properties that we own around our transit hubs to develop housing as well. And so, that's kind of our connection. We see, and the province and the municipalities with which we serve see a very, very big connection in where those developments are going to be developed. And it needs to be focused around our transit hubs.
Thank you. Just going back to what I was talking at the beginning in this flight to quality, are you seeing a broader range of investors approaching you, interested in investing? Is that something that you noticed changing with yield so high elsewhere?
Yeah, certainly as we embarked in our green bonds, we saw definitely an increase in the number of investors, which is very important to us to increase the investor base that we have. When we issue bonds, the more investors you have, I think the more successful that will be, obviously. And I think it really boded well with, when COVID hit. We do have a very good, I believe it's a very good investor program where we like to meet with our investors whenever they want, explain what's happening in transit, what's happening in TransLink, how are we recovering from COVID, so that when we do go to the market, they know, they don't have to ask the question again. They're up to date on what we're doing. So I think it really boded well when the market is so volatile that those questions are already answered.
Yeah, let me just sort of say, I think municipalities have not been very good at marketing themselves in the past. And I think when I first started doing some IR, I think it was about 15 years ago, I think we had about 6 buyers of our bonds. I mean, we didn't issue as much as we do now, but we started doing this, doing IR, and getting out, explaining the credit. And I think it's a very strong credit to start off. We are, as I said, that we're very highly rated. People just didn't understand us, didn't know who we were. We've now, having gone through this over a number of years, we typically have, well, we just did a debenture deal last week, and I think we had like 23, 24 buyers for $150 million. I think overall we've seen, and it depends upon the term, it depends upon, mainly the terms, types of projects and so forth we do. But we do get a number of, we probably have up to 60 or 70 regular buyers of ours. So yeah, I think we've seen that over the years. We are not green bond issuers at this point. That's something that we hope to be doing as we get into some of these other projects. I think our program isn't big enough to support doing a green bond and doing conventional bonds. So, but we are looking forward to continue to meet with people and explain the credit.
And are you getting pressure from investors to do more green bonds, or is that something?
Well, we haven't done labeled green bonds yet. But anybody who's heard me speak, I always say municipalities aren't exactly smokestack industries. I think by and large, they are leaders in what we traditionally call green projects. We do water, wastewater, transit. Those are typically labeled under green. And in terms of the social or social type bonds, what do we do with long-term care facilities? We have all sorts of things that we do that would qualify if we kind of broke them out and do that. And one thing that we're doing now in terms of our programs is actually listing those projects so people can see what we're actually financing, so they can make their own decisions on that. But like I said, it's more in terms of an issuer. I think people maybe should be thinking of us as a ESG type issuer, not necessarily that particular bond is an ESG bond.
That makes sense.
So if I can just add on investor development, MFA is a little bit unique. So we are the largest municipal issuer in Canada, together with City of Toronto, Montreal, then of course York and TransLink are important issuers as well. We've been pushing quite hard on, obviously we're all Canadian dollar issuers, so it's important to understand that. But what we have seen over the last decade is more and more Canadian dollar portfolios around the world. So both in the US, state funds and other asset managers have been investing in Canadian dollars, and central banks in particular have been increasing their Canadian dollar holdings. So MFA, we're a little bit unique in that we're a level 1, 0% risk-weighted asset as an infrastructure bank. So it has allowed us to deepen those particular type of buyers, central banks and official institutions. Also our deal sizes, we try to keep them quite large, and that's helped with our investor development. So we've seen quite an increase over the last 5 years in international. We sell 20% or so of our new issues internationally. And with respect to green bonds or ESG generally, we're also very focused on ESG. I would echo, I mean, obviously TransLink does issue green bonds because it's perfect for their business line. It fits perfectly with transit. In the case of MFA, we do focus on ESG and really the risks that it represents to our lending. And that's really our top focus. We have the same view that Ed has, that really we view all municipal issuance to be either social or green. So we do have a framework that we've set up, a sustainability bond framework, but we're not focused. We don't think people should be focused on the label. We think they should be focused on the issuer themselves. And I think with standardization happening in the ESG world, I see that happening with investors. They're making their own determination now of the issuer and the risks that climate represents to that issuer, and are they managing those risks well? And I believe that's sort of the next wave of social finance will be a focus on the issuer and how they're incorporating ESG into their credit.
As you get increasing, exposure from investors outside of Canada, are they asking for different things than Canadians are, or are the requests very similar?
So in terms of buyers of social finance, so it varies across. In Europe, they're quite more advanced compared to North America. So they do have specific requests. Some buyers in North America and in Europe do require labeling at this point because they haven't yet set up their investment teams to have the ability to analyze themselves. So there's value to labeling from that perspective, but it's a very small percentage. The thing that they have asked for, and which we've been doing for over 3 years now, is we tell them exactly where all our dollars go. So this associating our borrowing with the exact projects that we are investing in. So some are asking for that. But I think the next step is they really want to get a feel for how ESG-related risks are being managed, and particularly at MFA, because we're viewed as a bank or financial institution, as opposed to, say, a pure municipality or government. They really are interested in figuring out how are we doing our own credit analysis for our own loans and for our own investments, and how do risks impact local governments in BC.
Actually,
Ed, would you like to jump in? And then
just quickly, yeah, I should have mentioned in terms of the region that even though we're not issuing ESG bonds, label bonds now, we are developing a framework so that we will probably in the future, when we get involved in some of these large, particularly transit and water projects and so forth, where it will be the right time, we will have that ability to do it. But we are developing a framework now. And again, as Peter mentioned, we do end up marketing probably up to 20%. I think it's, it varies depending upon issue. We do market those in Canadian dollars into the US and sometimes into Europe.
Yeah, we're probably out of time, but I just wanted to mention, I agree with Peter in that investors, yes, they look at our green bond projects, what are they borrowing for, but they also evaluate us as an organization. And I've gotten that information as we meet with our investors regularly. They're looking at us as an organization. What are we like? What are we doing? Are we socially responsible? So yes, they want the green projects, but they also want to make sure that we're a good organization.
That makes sense. So thank you for sharing your views, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Zaresh Kazaneva, Funding Officer at International Finance Corporation, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Christine Dobby.
Good afternoon. It's almost afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Zaresh, for being with us. Zaresh is here from Washington. Really appreciate you making the time to speak with us. Zaresh is a funding officer at the International Finance Corporation, which is a member of the World Bank. And you provide financing for private investments in developing countries, and obviously have a lot of social and economic development goals that you try to reach with your funding. Can you talk generally about what the IFC does and how you approach funding, particularly with this sort of turbulent macroeconomic environment that we've been seeing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Christine. Indeed, IFC is a member of the World Bank Group, but we are a separate entity. We have a separate balance sheet and a funding program, separate issuer. IFC is the global development bank. It's the largest development bank that invests exclusively in private sector. So this is what we do. We share a common goal of fighting poverty and promoting prosperity, but through a slightly different avenue, where we invest in sustainable businesses in emerging markets and thus this create job growth in the member countries for us. So we provide loans, we make equity investments, and we mobilize capital to bring alongside us into businesses in emerging markets. And as the lender, as an investor, we have observed that during these tough macroeconomic situation, our client companies do face tighter financing conditions. They face higher inflation. And so there are definitely headwinds. But I would say that from IFC's business perspective, we approach it with some cautious optimism. It so happened that throughout the history of IFC, we've actually acted as a counter-cyclical investor. So the demand for our services, the demand for financing from IFC actually tends to rise during tighter macroeconomic conditions. And actually the numbers speak to themselves. So in financial year 2023, we actually were able to provide record financing to our clients in the long-term funding and the short-term funding, which was 44 billion of new investment commitments, and this was a 30% increase versus the previous year. So in a way, our shareholders expect us to step in when we face such macroeconomic conditions in the countries of our operations. I think one of the strategic approaches for us during these times is also to try to mobilize more funding from the private sector alongside us to enable access to finance for our clients. So for instance, 2 months ago, we signed a 3.5 billion credit insurance policy agreement with 13 global insurers to make sure that we are able to extend our funding to banks and other financial institutions in the world so that they, in turn, can provide more funding for to microfinance organizations, small and medium enterprises, women-owned enterprises, so the most vulnerable populations and businesses where we operate. And I think the increase in our investment activity basically is reflected in the dynamics of our funding program. So in the previous few years, our funding program did go down a bit, but in the last 2 years, we came back to the regular range of 12 to 14 billion of new funding per year. As a AAA-rated issuer, we have been successfully accessing the markets. In fact, we just printed a USD Global this morning, which was 4 times oversubscribed. I think wishful thinking. I think 4 is still a good number. But it's a social bond, so there we are in a way limited by the pipeline available because we select projects for those types of thematic bond issuances. And so the actual issuance is not that large, you would say. And in general, I think if we look at if we take a helicopter view, if we look at the long-term horizon, the funding program is expected to gradually increase for IFC, not only as a response to the cycle, but also because of the strategic vision by our shareholders who have actually increased our capital base. They have voted for a capital increase of $5.5 billion 2018, which is still ongoing. And the idea is that there's an expectation from IFC to really increase our impact, to increase our investment portfolio significantly by 2030. And so the funding program on our side would correspond accordingly to the increase in the investment pipeline.
So I want to ask you about some funding issues that you've done in Canada, in the Canadian dollar market. The IFC has done several in Canada, and a few in the recent few years, you've done them under your green and social frameworks. Can you talk about how you see the Canadian dollar market, and also a bit about how the nuances in doing the funding under the thematic bond framework that you mentioned?
Of course. So I feel that IFC made a strategic decision about maintaining presence in the Canadian dollar market. We have been in this market every year since 2018, aiming to have at least one benchmark issuance per year. And so at the moment, as you mentioned, we do have 5 benchmark issuances for the total amount of 3 billion Canadian dollars, or exceeding 3 billion Canadian dollars. And the idea here is that given our vision or a view of a gradual increase in the funding needs for IFC, we would like to maintain this strategic presence in the market, to be there as one of the investment options for many of you, for investors in Canada and also abroad. And so for us, it is very important to time the market, of course, because our main currency of operation is the US dollar, so we'll have to time the market with respect to proximity to the dollar level. We take a look at the supply flows, we'll look at the demand characteristics and different macroeconomic announcements. Of course, we also got a really good support from the Canadian dealer base in terms of recent changes and also tracking all the dynamics. And of course, we got a very good support from the Canadian investor base. And not only domestic Canadian investor base, but there is also a lot of interest internationally for products in the maple market from central banks, official institutions, bank treasuries, asset managers, pension funds, insurance companies. So that has been quite hardening demand to see, basically. And IFC bonds are eligible for FTSE Global Universe Index, and they offer an attractive pickup versus government yields, while basically providing a AAA rating, HQLA eligibility, and zero risk weighting under the Basel framework, and plus additional ESG profile of the issuer also helps to set us apart, I think, and provide value to investors. So I think that's been our approach in the Canadian dollar market.
On the ESG point, can you talk about how you provide investors with assurances that it's not greenwashing or other that there couldn't be other issues with the funding?
So we issue our bonds. We issue our bonds under our general corporate use of proceeds, basically framework, and then in addition to that, we have two themes where we issue thematic bonds such as green bonds and social bonds. So with respect to green bonds, we issue green bonds under our green bond framework that has been recently expanded this year to include biodiversity, ocean life protection, marine life protection, and other projects into the framework. And the kind of the way for us to ensure robustness of this framework is actually through a very thorough filtering of the projects that go into the pool of projects that are being financed through our green bonds. Our green bonds are the use of proceed bonds, where the proceeds of those bonds will finance a pool of green bond eligible projects. And these projects are selected from IFC's investments, overall IFC's investments projects, which already undergo a very rigorous ESG screening. Every project that we commit to, that we lend to or make an equity investment in, has to comply with IFC's performance standards and ESG standards, which are considered actually one of the benchmarks in the private sector for ESG screening. Every project, before being committed, is published on our website, and the public has 60 days or more sometimes to opine on any potential risks that this particular project can present to communities, or to opine on any ESG concerns. Every project gets an ESG specialist assigned to it that weighs particular risk. So that is on the overall investment portfolio basis. Out of these projects, certain projects get the climate smart nomination, or they are actually considered specifically climate advancing projects, whether they're climate adaptation or climate mitigation types of projects. And out of this pool, we select certain projects that are considered green bond eligible. So there are like 3 tiers of different selection and filtering that goes into the decision before we put these projects into the portfolio of projects that are being financed with green bonds. After that, we actually also provide to our investors the reporting, the impact reporting. So every year, investors get a report which shows every project that is being financed through the pool of green bonds that have been issued in that particular year. And that impact report is compliant with the green bond principles. So the robustness of this framework actually is something that our investors really appreciate, and the feedback that we get from them is that that particular rigor is something that they definitely would like to see going further for us. That's why we are keeping our green bond framework, of which we've been issuing for the last 10 years.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but I wonder if you could talk about any advantages or disadvantages you see of doing issues in the Canadian market versus other markets.
I think what we really appreciate in the Canadian market is the unique investor base that we're able to reach out here, and we're very happy to cater to it. We see good depths for the size of our funding aspirations. We are a mid-sized issuer compared to bigger issuers, for instance. I think we also appreciate the fact that Canadian investors have been a very vocal investor base in terms of interest and value of green and social bonds that we issue. Particularly, like 80% of our issuances represent green or social type of commitment. They are issued under the green or social bond frameworks. And so the Canadian investor base has been quite helpful to shape our strategy going forward to continue issuing of those particular programs. So I think these are the advantages we definitely see.
Any downsides?
Any downsides? I would say more of interest is always good. Yeah. Would like to see probably more of like maybe faster momentum sometimes in book building, maybe wider issuing opportunities. For us, again, we always monitor the comparative value versus the dollar funding or other funding. And so issuance windows can be quite narrow. And usually when these windows are present, you see a lot of competition coming in.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Zaresh. And I think we're almost at lunch break now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for a terrific morning. I'm here to tell you that it is lunchtime. We're just having lunch downstairs, so if you go out, badge out of the building. When you get through the security, take a left, go through the courtyard, past the giant Christmas tree. There's a restaurant, you can't miss it, Hutong. And we'll be back here at 1:50 for our next program. So thank you.
and I'm gonna be high as a kite by then. I miss the earth so much, I miss my wife. It's lonely out in space on such a timeless flight. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man they think I am at home. Oh no, 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 I'm a rocket man, rocket man, burning out his fuse out here alone. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man they think I am at home. Oh no, 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 I'm a rocket man, burning out his fuse out here alone. Mars ain't the kind of place to raise your kids. In fact, it's cold as hell, and there's no one there to raise them if you did. And all the science I don't understand, it's just my job 5 days a week. A rocket man, a rocket man. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man they think I am at home. Oh no, 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 I'm a rocket man, burning out his fuse out here alone. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man they think I am at home. Oh no, 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 I'm a rocket man, burning out his fuse out here alone. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long time. And I think it's gonna be a long, long Slow down, you crazy child. You're so ambitious for a juvenile. But then if you're so smart, tell me, why are you still so afraid? Where's the fire? What's the hurry about? You better cool it off before you burn it out. You got so much much to do and only so many hours in a day. Hey, but you know that when the truth is told, that you can get what you want or you can just get old. You're gonna kick off before you even get halfway through. Ooh, when will you realize Vienna waits for you? Slow down, you're doing fine. You can't be everything you wanna be before your time. Although it's so romantic on the borderline tonight, tonight. Too bad, but it's the life you lead. You're so ahead of yourself that you forgot what you need. Though you could see when you're wrong, you know you can't always see when you're right. You're right. You got your passion, you got your pride, but don't you know that only fools are satisfied? Dream on, but don't imagine they'll all come true. Ooh, when will you realize Vienna waits for you? Slow down, you crazy child, and take the phone off the hook and disappear for a while. It's alright, you can't afford to lose a day or two. Ooh, when will you realize Vienna waits for you? And you know that when the truth is told, that you can get what you want or you can just get old. You're gonna kick off before you even get halfway through. Ooh, why don't you realize Vienna waits for you? When will you realize Vienna waits for you?